Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a peaceful journey through the remarkable life of Henry II of England, one of medieval Europe's most brilliant yet tragic monarchs. Henry built a legal system that still forms the foundation of English common law, expanded royal power across a vast empire, and created the very foundations of the modern English monarchy. Yet his genius came with a price: family betrayal, religious scandal, and a legacy forever stained by the murder of England's most beloved saint. This complete journey will softly guide you through Henry's rise from a disputed heir to the ruler of an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, his revolutionary legal reforms that echo through courtrooms today, and the tragic destruction of his own family through ambition and pride. We'll explore his fateful friendship with Thomas Becket that ended in murder most foul, and witness how the man who built England's future died abandoned by the very children he raised to rule. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, please take a moment to like this video if you enjoy these soothing historical tales, and perhaps leave a gentle comment about what fascinates you most about medieval history. Your thoughts always bring such warmth to our community here. Don't forget to subscribe to keep these tranquil stories flowing into your bedtime routine. So settle in comfortably, close your eyes, and let the gentle whispers of the 12th century carry you toward restful sleep. If you're new to our Sleepy Crown family, welcome to this cozy circle where history's greatest figures find their peace, and so shall you. Henry, later known as King Henry II of England, entered this world on a crisp March morning in 1133 in the ancient French city of Le Mans. The castle where he drew his first breath stood on Norman soil, though he would come to rule an empire that stretched far beyond the boundaries his infant eyes could ever have imagined. His father was Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, a man known throughout France by the flattering epithet Plantagenet, the Fair, and his beauty was matched only by his political cunning and military prowess. Geoffrey ruled over the sprawling territories of Anjou, Touraine, and Maine, commanding much of northwestern and central France, at a time when that great kingdom remained a patchwork of competing duchies and counties. The French king in Paris held sway over a relatively modest domain, serving more as a feudal overlord than the absolute monarch France would later become. In this world of fragmented power and shifting allegiances, Geoffrey had carved out a position of considerable influence, controlling the vital trade routes and fertile lands that lay to the west of the French royal domains. Young Henry's mother brought even greater political significance to his lineage. Matilda, known to history as the Empress Matilda, was the daughter of King Henry I of England, and her very existence would shape the destiny of her infant son. She had previously been wed to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry V, a marriage that had elevated her to the highest ranks of European nobility before his death left her a widow. Her return to her father's court in England had been marked by his unprecedented decision to name her as his heir, a choice that would spark decades of conflict and bloodshed. The roots of Henry's claim to greatness stretched back to the Norman conquest itself. His great-grandfather was none other than William the Conqueror, the Duke of Normandy, whose victory at Hastings in 1066 had forever changed the course of English history. William had united the Norman duchy with the English crown, creating a cross-channel empire that his descendants would struggle to maintain. When William died in 1087, his vast domains were divided among his sons, with England passing to William Rufus and Normandy to Robert Curthose. But fortune's wheel turned swiftly in medieval politics. When William Rufus died in a hunting accident in 1100, some whispered it was murder. Matilda's father Henry had moved quickly to seize the English throne, despite being only the conqueror's fourth son. Henry the Femme proved himself a capable and ruthless ruler, consolidating Norman control over England, while fighting his elder brother Robert for control of Normandy. The brothers' conflict raged for years until Henry finally captured Robert at the Battle of Tinchebray in 1106, reuniting the Anglo-Norman realm under his sole authority. King Henry III had every expectation that his dynasty would continue through his legitimate male heir, Prince William. The young prince was everything a medieval king could desire in a successor: brave, intelligent, and beloved by the nobility. He had already begun participating in his father's government and military campaigns, preparing for the day when the crown would pass to him. But on one terrible night in 1120, when Henry was already in his early 50s and his heir was barely 17, disaster struck with swift and merciless finality. The White Ship disaster became one of the most mourned tragedies in medieval history. Prince William and many of England's young nobles had boarded the swift vessel for what should have been a routine crossing of the English Channel. The ship's captain, proud of his vessel's speed and eager to impress his royal passengers, had attempted to overtake the king's own ship in the dark waters near the Norman coast. Whether through navigational error, drunken seamanship, or simple misfortune, the White Ship struck submerged rocks and broke apart with shocking swiftness. Of the 300 souls aboard that vessel, only one survived to tell the tale: a butcher from Rouen who clung to wreckage through the freezing November night. Prince William had initially escaped the sinking ship, but when he heard his half-sister's cries for help from the dark waters, his noble heart compelled him to turn back. The overloaded rescue boat capsized under the weight of too many desperate survivors, and England's heir disappeared beneath the cold waves forever. When the lone survivor finally reached shore and word of the disaster reached King Henry, courtiers reported that the king never smiled again. The tragedy had not merely claimed his beloved son, it had thrown the entire question of succession into chaos. Medieval law and custom strongly favored male inheritance, and while Henry had legitimate daughters, the prospect of a woman ruling England was virtually unprecedented. Yet as the years passed, and it became clear that Henry would father no more legitimate sons, he began to contemplate the unthinkable. In 1125, King Henry made a decision that would plunge England into 2 decades of civil war. He summoned his nobles to court and demanded they swear fealty to his daughter Matilda as his heir. The assembled barons and bishops reluctantly agreed, though many harbored private doubts about accepting a woman's rule. These doubts deepened when Matilda married Geoffrey of Anjou in 1128, binding England's fate to the ambitious Angevin dynasty. The marriage between Matilda and Geoffrey was politically astute, but personally troubled. She was 11 years his senior, a proud and imperious woman, accustomed to the deference due an empress. Geoffrey was young, handsome, and ambitious, but he chafed under his wife's assumption of superiority. Their early years together were marked by quarrels and separations, though they eventually achieved a working relationship that would prove politically fruitful. When their first son was born in that March of 1133, the infant represented hope for the future stability of the Anglo-Norman realm. Here was a male heir who combined the legitimate royal blood of the Norman dynasty with the military prowess and territorial power of the Angevin counts. Little Henry carried within his tiny frame the potential to unite vast territories under a single crown, if he could survive the coming storms. The child's early years were spent in the comfortable surroundings of his father's castle at Le Mans, where he was cared for by Norman and Angevin servants who spoke to him in the French dialects of both regions. His education began early, as befitted a potential future king, with instruction in Latin letters, Christian doctrine, and the martial skills that would be essential for medieval rulership. Even as a small child, Henry displayed the restless energy and quick intelligence that would characterize his entire life. But storm clouds were already gathering on the horizon. King Henry III's health began to decline as he entered his 60s, and the question of succession weighed heavily upon his mind. Many English nobles had been born after the conquest and had spent their entire lives under Henry's strong rule. The prospect of accepting his daughter's authority, especially when it came married to foreign ambitions, troubled them greatly. Some began to look toward other potential claimants to the throne, including Henry's nephew, Stephen of Blois. The stage was set for one of England's most devastating civil wars, and at its center would be a 2-year-old child who had yet to speak his first complete sentence. Young Henry's comfortable world was about to be shattered by forces beyond his comprehension, and his path to the throne would require him to grow up quickly in a land torn apart by competing loyalties and burning ambitions. As 1135 dawned, few could have predicted that the toddling child at Le Mans would one day become the most powerful ruler in Western Europe, the boy who would revolutionize English law, build an empire spanning 2 kingdoms, and forever change the relationship between church and state, was still learning to walk steadily. But already, in his bright eyes and determined expression, observers might have glimpsed the iron will that would carry him through the trials ahead. The comfortable certainties of his early childhood were about to end forever, replaced by a world where survival itself would depend on wit, courage, and the loyal support of those who believed in his birthright. The making of King Henry II was about to begin, forged in the fires of civil war and tempered by the harsh realities of medieval politics. On the 1st of December 1135, King Henry III breathed his last after a brief but severe illness that struck him down while hunting in the Norman forests. His death at Lyons-la-Forêt marked the end of 35 years of strong, centralized rule and the beginning of a period so chaotic and destructive that chroniclers would remember it simply as the Anarchy. The 2-year-old Henry, playing peacefully in his nursery at Le Mans, had suddenly become the focal point of a succession crisis that would tear apart 2 kingdoms. The swift and decisive action taken by Henry I's nephew, Stephen of Blois, in the immediate aftermath of the king's death, changed the course of English history. While Matilda and Geoffrey were far away in Anjou, Stephen was much closer to the centres of power in both Normandy and England. More importantly, he was a man in a world that still expected masculine leadership, and his very gender gave him an automatic advantage over his female cousin, regardless of the legitimacy of her claim. Stephen moved with the speed and ruthlessness that medieval politics demanded. Within weeks of his uncle's death, he had crossed the English Channel, secured the support of key nobles and bishops, and had himself crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. His claim to the throne rested on several foundations: his status as Henry III's nephew, his masculine gender, and his promises to restore many of the traditional rights and privileges that Henry I had curtailed. In his drive towards centralized royal power, the new king's early support came from multiple sources. Many English nobles genuinely preferred the prospect of male rule over the uncertainty of accepting a woman's authority. The church hierarchy, led by Stephen's brother Henry of Blois, Bishop of Winchester, threw their considerable influence behind his cause. Most importantly, Stephen's seizure of the royal treasury at Winchester provided him with the financial resources necessary to reward his supporters and hire the mercenaries who would prove crucial in the coming conflicts. But Stephen's usurpation, for that is how Matilda and her supporters viewed it, was never going to go unchallenged. The Empress had not spent years preparing for her inheritance, only to see it stolen by her cousin's swift action. From her base in Anjou, she began organizing resistance to Stephen's rule. calling upon those English and Norman nobles who had sworn fealty to her cause. Her husband Geoffrey proved an invaluable ally in this effort, bringing the military resources of the Angevin territories to bear against Stephen's position. The early years of the Anarchy established a pattern that would persist throughout the conflict. Neither side possessed the overwhelming strength necessary to achieve total victory, but each commanded sufficient resources to prevent their opponent from achieving lasting success. Stephen controlled most of England, including London and the crucial southeastern ports, but significant portions of the West Country remained loyal to Matilda's cause. In Normandy, the situation was reversed, with Geoffrey gradually conquering the duchy, while Stephen struggled to maintain his footholds there. Young Henry's childhood unfolded against this backdrop of constant warfare and shifting political allegiances. His earliest memories were likely filled with the sounds of armed men moving through his father's castles, the hushed conversations of adults discussing military campaigns and political strategy, and the constant sense of uncertainty that pervaded even the strongest fortifications. The comfortable world of a royal child had been replaced by the harsh realities of a disputed inheritance. As the boy grew from toddler to child, he began to understand that he was not merely Henry of Anjou, but a claimant to one of Europe's most powerful thrones. His mother Matilda never let him forget the destiny that awaited him if their cause should triumph. She filled his young mind with stories of his grandfather King Henry III, of the great William the Conqueror whose blood flowed in his veins, and of the responsibilities that would someday rest upon his shoulders. The political education of the future Henry II began remarkably early. By the age of 5, he was accompanying his parents to councils of war and diplomatic meetings, observing how alliances were forged and broken, how loyalty was rewarded and betrayal punished. The boy learned to read not only Latin texts, but also the subtle expressions on men's faces when they pledged their support, and he began to understand which promises could be trusted and which were merely convenient expedients. Geoffrey of Anjou proved himself a formidable military commander during these years, systematically conquering Normandy castle by castle, while Stephen was preoccupied with rebellions in England. The Count's success in Normandy was crucial to young Henry's eventual triumph, as it provided the territorial base and financial resources that would prove essential in the later stages of the conflict. More importantly, Geoffrey's victories demonstrated to wavering nobles that the Angevin cause was not merely a hopeless dream, but a viable political force. The human cost of the anarchy was enormous. Chronicles from the period describe a land where God and his angels slept, where the strong oppressed the weak without fear of royal justice, and where unlicensed castles sprouted like poisonous mushrooms across the English countryside. Trade collapsed, agriculture suffered, and the careful administrative machinery that Henry Vernon had constructed to govern his realm fell apart under the strain of constant warfare. For young Henry, these years of chaos provided an invaluable education in the arts of war and statecraft. He learned to distinguish between temporary tactical retreats and genuine defeats, to understand the importance of maintaining supply lines during extended campaigns, and to appreciate the crucial role that castles played in medieval warfare. Most importantly, he observed firsthand the devastating consequences of weak central authority and the vital importance of maintaining the loyalty of one's supporters. The boy's formal education continued despite the political turmoil surrounding his family. His parents ensured that he received instruction in Latin, rhetoric, mathematics, and the other subjects considered essential for a medieval prince. But his most important lessons came from watching his mother's determined struggle to reclaim her birthright and his father's methodical conquest of Normandy. These experiences taught him that success in medieval politics required not only legitimate claims and noble blood, but also practical skills, unwavering determination, and the ability to inspire loyalty in others. By 1141, when Henry had reached his 8th birthday, the tide of the Anarchy began to turn in his family's favour. Matilda succeeded in capturing Stephen himself at the Battle of Lincoln, temporarily reversing their positions and raising the Empress's hopes of finally claiming her throne. For a few brief months, it seemed that the long struggle might be nearing its end, with Henry potentially ascending to his grandfather's throne while still a child. But the victory proved ephemeral. Matilda's imperious behavior and her reliance on foreign supporters alienated many potential allies, while Stephen's queen, also named Matilda, organized effective resistance to the Empress's rule. The Empress was eventually forced to flee England, while Stephen was released from captivity in exchange for his most prominent supporter. The war would continue, but its resolution seemed as distant as ever. As the Anarchy dragged on year after year, young Henry began to emerge as a figure of growing importance in his parents' calculations. No longer merely a child whose future was being decided by others, he was becoming a young man whose own actions might determine the ultimate outcome of the conflict. The question now was whether this child of war and politics possessed the strength and wisdom necessary to succeed, where his mother had struggled for so long. As young Henry approached his 7th birthday in 1140, his parents made a crucial decision that would fundamentally shape his character and prepare him for the challenges that lay ahead. The boy was sent to the ancient city of Anjou to live in his father's ancestral castle, where he would receive the comprehensive education befitting a future king. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in his development, one that would transform him from a child of uncertain destiny into a prince fully conscious of his royal heritage and the responsibilities it entailed. The castle of Anjou was a magnificent structure that spoke eloquently of the power and ambition of the Angevin dynasty. Its massive stone walls rose from foundations laid by Henry's ancestors, each generation adding their own improvements and expansions to create a fortress that was both militarily formidable and suitable for the ceremonial requirements of a great noble house. The great hall, where Henry would take his meals, could accommodate hundreds of retainers, while the private chambers reserved for the Count's family were adorned with tapestries and furnishings that rivaled those found in any royal palace. Here, surrounded by the visible symbols of Angevin power, Henry began his formal education under the guidance of Peter of Saintes, a learned scholar whose reputation extended far beyond the borders of France. Peter was not merely a teacher of letters, but a man of wide learning who had travelled extensively throughout Europe, studying at the great cathedral schools and absorbing the intellectual currents of his age. His appointment as Henry's tutor reflected Geoffrey's understanding that his son would need more than martial skills to succeed as a king. He would need the intellectual capacity to govern complex territories and navigate the treacherous waters of international diplomacy. Under Peter's patient instruction, Henry mastered the fundamentals of Latin grammar and rhetoric, skills that were absolutely essential for a medieval ruler who would need to conduct correspondence with popes, emperors, and fellow kings throughout Europe. But Peter's teaching went far beyond mere technical proficiency. He introduced his young pupil to the great works of classical literature, opening Henry's mind to the wisdom of ancient authors and the timeless lessons they offered about leadership, justice, and the proper conduct of rulers. The boy proved an eager and gifted student. His naturally quick intelligence combined with an almost boundless curiosity about the world around him. He absorbed not only his formal lessons, but also the practical knowledge that came from living in one of medieval Europe's greatest noble households. He observed how his father's officials managed the complex business of governing multiple territories, how diplomatic envoys were received and entertained, and how the delicate balance between authority and consent was maintained in dealings with vassals and allies. The martial arts received equal attention in Henry's education. Medieval kingship required personal courage and military skill, and Geoffrey ensured that his son received thorough training in the use of sword, lance, and bow. Henry spent countless hours in the castle's practice yards, learning not only individual combat techniques, but also the fundamentals of cavalry tactics and siege warfare. His instructors were veterans of Geoffrey's campaigns in Normandy, men who could teach him not only theoretical knowledge, but also the practical skills that might someday save his life on the battlefield. But perhaps most importantly, Henry learned the art of leadership by watching his father govern the Angevin territories. Geoffrey was a skilled administrator who understood that lasting power required more than military conquest. It demanded the creation of effective governmental institutions and the cultivation of genuine loyalty among one's subjects. The Count's methods were often harsh, but they were always purposeful, designed to establish and maintain the authority that was essential for good governance. As Henry grew older and more sophisticated in his understanding, his education began to take on increasingly practical dimensions. He was permitted to attend council meetings where important decisions were made. Observing how his father balanced competing interests and managed the complex relationships between various noble families, he learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated whether a vassal's loyalty was genuine or merely expedient, and he began to understand how rewards and punishments could be used to shape behavior and maintain discipline. The boy's religious education was equally thorough. Medieval kingship was understood to be a sacred trust, with rulers serving as God's representatives on earth. Henry learned not only the doctrines and practices of Christianity, but also the complex relationships between secular and ecclesiastical authority that would prove so crucial in his later conflicts with the Church. His tutors emphasized the king's duty to protect the Church and promote justice, but they also made clear that royal authority derived directly from God and could not be subordinated to any earthly power. During these formative years, Henry also began to develop the remarkable linguistic abilities that would serve him so well throughout his reign. In addition to Latin, which served as the common tongue of educated Europeans, he became fluent in the various French dialects spoken throughout his father's territories. He could converse easily with Norman nobles, Angevin knights, and Aquitanian merchants, adapting his speech to the particular customs and expectations of each group. This linguistic flexibility would prove invaluable when he eventually came to rule over territories stretching from Scotland to Spain. The young prince's education was not confined to formal instruction within the castle walls. Geoffrey regularly took his son on progress through the Angevin territories, allowing him to see firsthand how the various regions under their control differed in their customs, economic activities, and political traditions. Henry learned to appreciate the rich diversity of his inheritance, while understanding the common threads that bound these territories together under Angevin rule. These journeys also provided opportunities for Henry to meet and interact with the men, who would eventually serve as his vassals and allies. He learned their names, their family histories, their particular strengths and weaknesses. More importantly, he began to understand how personal relationships formed the foundation of medieval political systems. Loyalty was not simply a matter of legal obligation, but of personal bonds forged through shared experiences, mutual respect, and carefully calculated exchanges of favor and service. As Henry approached adolescence, his parents began to consider the next phase of his education. The boy had outgrown what even the most learned tutors in Anjou could offer him, and it was clear that his preparation for kingship would require exposure to broader intellectual currents and more sophisticated forms of statecraft. The decision was made to send him to England. Despite the obvious risks involved in placing the claimant to the throne within reach of Stephen's forces, this decision reflected both the confidence that Geoffrey and Matilda had developed in their son's abilities and their recognition that he could no longer remain merely a passive beneficiary of their struggles on his behalf. At the age of 9, Henry was ready to begin taking an active role in the campaign to secure his birthright. The comfortable years of childhood were ending, and the serious business of claiming a kingdom was about to begin. The boy who prepared to cross the English Channel in 1142 was no longer the uncertain child who had been born into civil war 9 years earlier. He had received the finest education available to a medieval prince, combining classical learning with practical training in the arts of war and governance. Most importantly, he had absorbed the confidence and determination that would be essential for the challenges that lay ahead. Henry was ready to begin his transformation from prince to king. The decision to send 9-year-old Henry to England in 1142 was both bold and dangerous, reflecting the complex calculations that governed medieval politics. By placing their son within Stephen's reach, Geoffrey and Matilda were taking an enormous risk, but they were also making a powerful statement about their confidence in ultimate victory. The boy's presence in England would galvanize their supporters while providing Henry with invaluable first-hand experience of the kingdom he was destined to rule. Bristol had been chosen as Henry's destination with careful consideration. This prosperous port city on the River Severn had emerged as the de facto capital of Matilda's cause in England. Controlled by Robert of Gloucester, the Empress's illegitimate half-brother and most capable military commander. The castle that dominated the city was one of the strongest fortifications in England, its massive stone walls rising above the surrounding countryside as a symbol of Angevin power in the west. The journey across the English Channel was Henry's first real taste of the dangers that accompanied his exalted position. The narrow seas between England and the continent were patrolled by ships loyal to both sides in the Civil War, and the possibility of capture by Stephen's forces was very real. The small fleet carrying the young prince hugged the coastline whenever possible, ready to dart into friendly harbours if enemy vessels appeared on the horizon. When Henry's ship finally reached the safety of Bristol's harbour, he was greeted by scenes that would remain etched in his memory for the rest of his life. The city bustled with military activity as Robert of Gloucester's forces prepared for the next phase of their campaign against Stephen. Knights in mail hauberks rode through the narrow streets, their destriers' hooves echoing off the stone buildings, while merchants hawked supplies to the endless stream of soldiers and camp followers who filled the taverns and markets. The castle itself was a revelation to the young prince. Though he had grown up in his father's fortresses in Anjou, nothing had quite prepared him for the scale and sophistication of this English stronghold. The great keep towered above the surrounding structures, its walls thick enough to withstand the most powerful siege engines of the age. The apartments prepared for Henry's use were spacious and comfortable, befitting his status as the rightful heir to England's throne. But comfort was not the primary purpose of Henry's sojourn in England. His tutors had accompanied him across the Channel, and his formal education continued unabated despite the change of scenery. If anything, his studies took on new urgency as he began to learn about the specific challenges facing English governance. He studied the kingdom's laws and customs, its economic foundations, and the complex web of relationships that bound together its various regions and social classes. The young prince's education now included regular briefings on military and political developments throughout the kingdom. He learned to read the detailed reports that arrived daily from scouts and agents, developing an understanding of strategy and tactics that went far beyond what he could have absorbed from books alone. The ebb and flow of the Civil War became his classroom, teaching him lessons about loyalty, betrayal, courage, and calculation that no formal tutor could have provided. Henry's presence in Bristol also served important symbolic purposes. For the first time, Matilda's English supporters could see and interact with the boy in whose name they were fighting. No longer was he merely an abstract concept, a distant prince whose claim existed only in legal documents and diplomatic correspondence. He was a real child whose future depended directly on their courage and dedication. And this personal connection proved tremendously motivating for the Empress's cause. The young prince threw himself into this role with remarkable sophistication for one so young. He learned to conduct himself with the dignity appropriate to his royal status, while remaining approachable enough to inspire genuine affection among his supporters. His natural charm and quick intelligence made him popular with knights and nobles alike, and his growing reputation for wisdom beyond his years began to attract attention throughout England. But the experience of living in a kingdom torn apart by civil war also exposed Henry to the harsh realities of medieval politics. He witnessed the aftermath of battles, saw refugees fleeing from areas devastated by warfare, and observed the breakdown of law and order that inevitably accompanied weak central authority. These experiences taught him lessons about the importance of strong kingship that he would carry with him throughout his reign. The young prince's stay in England was not without its dangers. Stephen's forces launched several raids into the areas around Bristol, and on more than one occasion, Henry found himself uncomfortably close to enemy troops. These encounters taught him valuable lessons about personal security and the need for constant vigilance that would serve him well in later years. More importantly, they gave him first-hand experience of the courage and loyalty displayed by the men who risked their lives in his service. As months passed, Henry began to play an increasingly active role in his mother's cause. Though still too young for actual combat, he participated in councils of war and diplomatic meetings, contributing his observations and gradually gaining the confidence to offer his own suggestions. His tutors were amazed by his ability to absorb complex information and think strategically about political and military problems. The boy's religious education continued under the guidance of clergy loyal to Matilda's cause, but it now took on practical dimensions as well as theoretical ones. He learned about the complex relationships between church and state that had complicated his grandfather's reign, and he began to understand how ecclesiastical support could be crucial in legitimizing royal authority. These lessons would prove prophetic given his later conflicts with Thomas Becket. Perhaps most importantly, Henry's time in England allowed him to develop personal relationships with many of the men who would later serve as his most trusted advisors and military commanders. He learned their individual strengths and weaknesses, their personal motivations and loyalties. This intimate knowledge of his supporters would prove invaluable when he eventually became king and needed to weld together a diverse group of nobles and administrators into an effective governing coalition. As 1144 approached, it became clear that Henry had outgrown what England could offer him during this phase of the Civil War. The military situation had stabilized into a frustrating stalemate, with neither side able to achieve decisive victory. More importantly, the boy was reaching an age where he needed more advanced instruction than could be provided in a military camp, no matter how well-intentioned his tutors might be. The decision was made to return Henry to the continent, where he could continue his education under more settled conditions, while remaining available to play a more active role in his parents' campaigns when opportunities arose. His departure from Bristol was marked by genuine sadness among the many supporters who had come to love and respect the young prince during his stay among them. The boy who boarded ship for the return journey to Anjou was markedly different from the child who had arrived 2 years earlier. He had seen warfare and diplomacy at the highest levels, had learned to read the subtle currents of political opinion, and had begun to develop the personal magnetism that would serve him so well as an adult ruler. Most importantly, he had gained a deep understanding of the challenges facing English kingship and had begun to formulate his own ideas about how those challenges might be met. Henry's English sojourn had been a crucial phase in his development from child to future king. The lessons he learned during those formative years would influence every major decision of his reign, from his legal reforms to his conflicts with the church, to his struggles with his own family. The foundation for one of medieval England's greatest reigns had been laid in the uncertain years of the Anarchy, tempered by the harsh realities of civil war and strengthened by the loyalty of those who believed in his destiny. When Henry returned to the continent in 1144, his parents recognized that their 11-year-old son required an education that matched his growing sophistication and the expanding scope of his future responsibilities. The boy, who had spent 2 crucial years observing the realities of warfare and statecraft in England, needed instruction that could build upon these practical experiences while providing him with the intellectual framework necessary for effective kingship. The decision was made to place him under the tutelage of William of Conches, one of the most celebrated scholars of the age. William of Conches represented the very pinnacle of 12th century learning. A Norman by birth but cosmopolitan in his intellectual outlook, he had studied at the great Cathedral school of Chartres, where he had absorbed the latest developments in philosophy, theology, and natural science. His reputation extended throughout Europe, and his works on grammar, philosophy, and natural philosophy were studied in schools from England to Italy. More importantly for Henry's purposes, William had also served as tutor to nobles and had practical experience in preparing young men for positions of high responsibility. The scholar's approach to education was revolutionary for its time, emphasizing not merely the memorization of classical texts, but the development of critical thinking skills that would enable his students to grapple with novel problems and situations. William believed that effective leadership required not just knowledge, but wisdom, the ability to apply learning to the practical challenges of governance and statecraft. This philosophy aligned perfectly with Geoffrey and Matilda's vision for their son's preparation for kingship. Under William's guidance, Henry's intellectual horizons expanded dramatically. His earlier grounding in Latin grammar and rhetoric was refined and deepened, enabling him to appreciate the subtleties of classical literature and to express himself with precision and eloquence. But William's instruction went far beyond linguistic skills. He introduced Henry to the great philosophical works of antiquity, helping him understand the fundamental questions about justice, authority, and the proper relationship between rulers and subjects that had occupied thinkers from Aristotle to Augustine. The young prince proved to be an exceptionally gifted student. His natural intelligence was matched by an insatiable curiosity about the world around him and an ability to make connections between seemingly disparate areas of knowledge. William later wrote that he had rarely encountered a mind so quick to grasp complex concepts or so eager to explore their practical applications. Henry's questions often pushed his tutor to think more deeply about familiar subjects, and their conversations became genuine intellectual collaborations rather than simple instruction. Mathematics and natural philosophy occupied an important place in Henry's curriculum, reflecting William's belief that effective governance required understanding of practical subjects as well as classical learning. Henry learned to calculate distances and quantities with precision, skills that would prove invaluable when planning military campaigns or assessing the economic resources of his territories. More importantly, his study of natural philosophy taught him to think systematically about cause and effect, preparation that would serve him well when grappling with the complex problems of statecraft. The prince's religious education under William's guidance was both thorough and sophisticated. Rather than simply memorizing doctrinal formulations, Henry was encouraged to understand the theological principles that underlay Christian teaching and to appreciate how these principles applied to the practical challenges facing Christian rulers. William was particularly careful to help his student understand the complex relationship between temporal and spiritual authority, a subject that would prove crucial during Henry's later conflicts with the Church. Geography and history received careful attention in Henry's curriculum, as William recognized that the future king would need intimate knowledge of the territories he was destined to rule. Using the best maps and chronicles available, Henry learned about the physical characteristics of his potential domains, their economic resources, and the historical developments that had shaped their political and cultural traditions. This knowledge would prove invaluable when he eventually came to govern territories stretching from Scotland to Spain. But perhaps most importantly, William encouraged Henry to develop his own ideas about effective kingship and good governance, rather than simply accepting traditional formulations about royal authority. The young prince was encouraged to think critically about the challenges facing medieval rulers and to consider how these challenges might be met more effectively. These intellectual exercises laid the groundwork for the innovative approaches to law and administration that would characterize Henry's reign. The prince's linguistic abilities continued to develop during this period, as William recognized that effective communication would be essential for ruling over diverse territories. In addition to his existing fluency in Latin and various French dialects, Henry began studying the languages and customs of other regions that might eventually come under his rule. His remarkable facility for languages would later enable him to communicate directly with subjects throughout his empire without relying on interpreters. As Henry approached his 14th birthday, his education began to take on increasingly practical dimensions. William arranged for him to observe and participate in mock diplomatic negotiations, legal proceedings, and administrative councils. These exercises allowed Henry to apply the theoretical knowledge he had acquired to realistic scenarios that he might face as a ruler. His performance in these simulations impressed all who observed them, demonstrating not only his mastery of the material, but also his natural aptitude for leadership. The relationship between tutor and student evolved during these years from one of simple instruction to genuine intellectual partnership. William came to rely on Henry's insights and observations, finding that the young prince's questions often illuminated aspects of familiar problems that had previously escaped notice. This experience of being treated as an intellectual equal helped build Henry's confidence and prepared him for the day when he would need to hold his own in discussions with the most learned men of his age. By 1147, when Henry reached his 14th birthday, it was clear that he had received as thorough an education as medieval Europe could provide. He was fluent in multiple languages, well-versed in classical literature and philosophy, knowledgeable about law and administration, and equipped with the critical thinking skills necessary for effective leadership. More importantly, he had developed the intellectual curiosity and love of learning that would serve him throughout his life. But education, however comprehensive, was only one aspect of preparation for medieval kingship. The time had come for Henry to begin translating his knowledge into practical experience, to test himself against the real challenges of warfare and statecraft. His parents had been carefully monitoring his development, and they judged that their son was now ready to begin taking an active role in the struggle for his inheritance. The year 1147 marked a crucial turning point in young Henry's development from educated prince to active claimant for the English throne. At 14, he was considered to have reached the age of majority in medieval terms, old enough to bear arms and make binding political commitments. More importantly, the strategic situation in both England and Normandy had evolved in ways that created new opportunities for aggressive action against Stephen's increasingly precarious position. Geoffrey of Anjou's methodical conquest of Normandy was approaching its successful conclusion. Castle by castle, town by town, the Angevin forces had systematically reduced Stephen's supporters until only a few isolated strongholds remained in royal hands. This success provided Henry with a secure base of operations and the resources necessary to mount serious campaigns across the English Channel. More importantly, it demonstrated that the Angevin cause was capable of achieving concrete military victories, encouraging wavering supporters and intimidating potential opponents. The decision to launch Henry's first independent military expedition reflected careful calculation by his parents and advisors. The young prince needed to establish his personal reputation as a military commander, while demonstrating his commitment to reclaiming his inheritance. But the risks were enormous. Failure could irreparably damage his cause, while capture by Stephen's forces might end his pretensions forever. The expedition would need to be planned with extraordinary care and executed with professional competence. The small fleet that assembled in Norman harbours during the summer of 1147 represented the concentrated hopes and resources of the Angevin cause. Henry's force was deliberately kept modest in size, consisting primarily of experienced knights and men-at-arms who had proven their loyalty during Geoffrey's Norman campaigns. Quality, rather than quantity, was the guiding principle, as the expedition would need to rely on speed and tactical skill, rather than overwhelming numbers to achieve its objectives. The young prince's first glimpse of England from the deck of his transport ship must have stirred complex emotions. This was the kingdom that was rightfully his, the inheritance that had been stolen by his cousin's usurpation 12 years earlier. But it was also a hostile land where Stephen's supporters controlled most of the major cities and fortresses. Success would require not only military skill, but also the ability to inspire his existing supporters while winning over those who had previously remained neutral or hostile. The landing was accomplished without serious opposition, as Henry's forces made use of harbours controlled by his mother's supporters in the west of England. But the real test would come when they moved inland and confronted Stephen's forces in open battle. The young prince had studied military tactics extensively, but theoretical knowledge was no substitute for the harsh realities of medieval warfare. Lives would depend on his ability to make sound decisions under pressure. Henry's first campaign demonstrated both his potential and his limitations. He showed genuine talent for tactical planning and possessed the personal courage necessary to inspire his followers. His natural charisma and obvious commitment to his cause attracted new supporters and reinvigorated existing ones. But he also learned harsh lessons about the complexities of medieval warfare and the importance of adequate preparation and logistics. The campaign's most significant achievement was not military, but political. For the first time, Henry had appeared in England as an active claimant to the throne, rather than merely the theoretical heir of his mother's cause. His presence galvanized supporters throughout the kingdom and forced Stephen to take his challenge seriously. Even though no decisive battles were fought, the expedition succeeded in establishing Henry as a serious political force in his own right. The young prince's conduct during the campaign impressed observers on both sides of the conflict. Despite his youth, he demonstrated the self-discipline and judgment expected of a mature commander. He showed concern for his followers' welfare, consulted with experienced advisors, and avoided the rash decisions that might have been expected from someone his age. These qualities enhanced his reputation and convinced many nobles that he possessed the character necessary for effective kingship. Perhaps most importantly, the campaign provided Henry with invaluable first-hand experience of English conditions and politics. He was able to assess the strength and loyalty of his supporters, identify potential new allies, and gain insight into the factors that would determine the ultimate success or failure of his cause. This knowledge would prove crucial in planning future operations and in understanding the challenges he would face as king. The expedition also brought Henry into contact with some of the men who would later play crucial roles in his reign. Military commanders, administrative officials, and church leaders who supported his cause had the opportunity to observe his character and abilities directly. Many came away convinced that they were witnessing the emergence of a future king, whose reign might restore the stability and prosperity that England had lost during the long years of civil war. When Henry returned to Normandy later in 1147, he brought with him not only military experience, but also a deeper understanding of his destiny and responsibilities. The boy who had departed as a promising student and theoretical heir returned as a proven military commander with legitimate claims to recognition as England's rightful king. The transformation was noted by all who knew him, and it marked the beginning of his emergence as the dominant figure in the Angevin cause. The success of this first expedition encouraged Henry's supporters and convinced his parents that their son was ready for greater responsibilities. Plans began immediately for more ambitious operations that would test his abilities against more serious challenges. But first, there were important political developments in France that required careful attention and skillful handling. King David III of Scotland had emerged as one of Henry's most important allies during this period. Recognizing that supporting the young prince's cause served Scottish interests by weakening Stephen's position, the alliance between the Angevin claimant and the Scottish king provided Henry with valuable military assistance while giving him experience in the complex diplomatic relationships that would characterize his reign. David's support also lent additional legitimacy to Henry's cause, as it demonstrated that established rulers recognized his claim to the English throne. But the most significant development was the return of King Louis VII of France from the Second Crusade. Louis had spent several years in the Holy Land, participating in the largely unsuccessful attempt to expand Crusader territory in the Eastern Mediterranean. His absence had provided Geoffrey with the opportunity to complete his conquest of Normandy without significant French interference. Now that Louis had returned, the political calculations governing Henry's cause would become considerably more complex. The French king's primary concern was preventing the unification of England, Normandy, and the other Angevin territories under a single ruler who might become powerful enough to challenge French hegemony. Louis was willing to support Stephen against Henry, or Henry against Stephen, depending on which course seemed more likely to maintain the division of Henry's potential inheritance. This pragmatic approach to diplomacy would characterize French policy toward the Angevin territories for generations to come. Understanding these complex political realities was crucial for Henry's continued development as a future king. He needed to learn how to navigate the treacherous waters of international diplomacy while maintaining focus on his primary objective of securing the English throne. The lessons he learned during this period would serve him well throughout his reign, as he would face constant challenges from French kings who sought to exploit divisions within the Angevin territories. As 1148 dawned, Henry stood at a crucial crossroads in his young life. He had successfully made the transition from student to soldier, from theoretical heir to active claimant. The foundations for his eventual success had been laid, but the greatest challenges still lay ahead. The time was approaching when he would need to stake everything on a final bid for his inheritance, and the outcome would determine not only his own fate, but the future of England itself. In the spring of 1152, 19-year-old Henry faced a decision that would fundamentally alter the balance of power in medieval Europe and set the stage for the creation of one of history's most remarkable empires. The opportunity that presented itself came in the form of Eleanor of Aquitaine, recently divorced from King Louis VII of France and suddenly available as one of the most eligible and politically valuable brides in Christendom. The marriage that would follow represented not merely a romantic union, but a strategic alliance that would reshape the map of Western Europe. Eleanor herself was a figure of extraordinary complexity and power, a woman whose influence extended far beyond the traditional confines of medieval female authority. At 30 years of age, she was 11 years Henry's senior, a sophisticated and experienced noblewoman who had already worn the crown of France and participated in the Second Crusade. Her divorce from Louis VII had been granted on grounds of consanguinity, the canonical prohibition against marriage between relatives, but everyone understood that the real reasons lay in the couple's fundamental incompatibility and Eleanor's failure to produce the male heir that France desperately needed. The Duchy of Aquitaine that Eleanor controlled in her own right was among the richest and most strategically important territories in France, stretching from the Loire Valley in the north to the Pyrenees in the south, and from the Atlantic coast eastward to the borders of Toulouse. Aquitaine encompassed some of the most fertile and prosperous lands in Western Europe. The duchy's vineyards produced wines that were prized throughout the continent, while its position along major trade routes generated enormous commercial revenues. Perhaps most importantly, Aquitaine's southern borders provided access to the crucial passes through the Pyrenees and potential influence in the emerging Christian kingdoms of Spain. Eleanor's court at Poitiers had become renowned throughout Europe as a center of learning, culture, and courtly refinement. Troubadours and scholars flocked to her patronage, creating an atmosphere of intellectual sophistication that rivaled anything found in Paris or Rome. This cultural flowering was not merely decorative. It reflected Eleanor's genuine intelligence and political acumen, qualities that made her a formidable ally or a dangerous enemy depending on the circumstances. The political implications of Eleanor's divorce from Louis VII were immediately apparent to astute observers throughout Europe. Her failure to produce male heirs for France had been the source of growing tension between the royal couple, but it also meant that any future husband might gain control over her vast territories through their children. For an ambitious young nobleman like Henry, marriage to Eleanor represented an opportunity to add the wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine to his existing possessions in Normandy, Anjou, and Maine, creating a territorial empire that would dwarf the holdings of any other European ruler, save the Holy Roman Emperor. But the opportunity also came with enormous risks. Louis VII would inevitably view Henry's marriage to his former wife as a personal insult and a direct threat to French interests. The union would transform Henry from a manageable problem into an existential danger to French security. Louis would have no choice but to oppose such a marriage with all the resources at his command, potentially triggering a general European war that could destroy Henry's ambitions forever. The negotiations leading up to the marriage were conducted in extraordinary secrecy, with both Henry and Eleanor understanding that premature disclosure of their plans might provoke Louis into military intervention. Eleanor's movements following her divorce were carefully monitored by French agents, while Henry's activities were scrutinized by observers seeking signs of his intentions. The couple's ability to communicate and coordinate their plans without detection testified to their political sophistication and the loyalty of their supporters. The speed with which the marriage was concluded once the negotiations were complete reflected the urgency both parties felt about avoiding French interference. On May 18, 1152, just 8 weeks after Eleanor's divorce from Louis became final, she and Henry exchanged vows in a small ceremony at Poitiers. The modesty of the occasion belied its enormous significance. With this single act, the balance of power in Western Europe had been fundamentally altered. The immediate reaction from Paris was exactly what Henry and Eleanor had anticipated. Louis VII flew into a rage that reportedly lasted for days, alternating between threats of military action and attempts to have the marriage annulled on various canonical grounds. The French court began immediate preparations for war, while Louis sought allies among other European rulers who might be persuaded to join an alliance against the dangerously powerful Angevin Union. But Henry and Eleanor had prepared for this reaction and were ready to defend their new alliance. The combined military resources of Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine provided them with formidable defensive capabilities, while their control of extensive Atlantic coastline offered strategic flexibility that their enemies lacked. More importantly, their union created new possibilities for diplomatic alliances with rulers who had their own reasons for opposing French expansion. The military conflict that erupted in the summer of 1152 was mercifully brief, but extraordinarily significant. Louis's forces, hastily assembled and operating far from their home bases, proved unable to achieve decisive results against Henry and Eleanor's well-prepared defenses. The campaign revealed important weaknesses in French military capabilities, while demonstrating the effectiveness of the Angevin administrative and military systems that Geoffrey of Anjou had spent years developing. Perhaps more importantly, the war provided Henry with his first opportunity to work closely with Eleanor in planning and executing major political and military operations. The partnership that emerged from these shared challenges would prove to be one of the most formidable political alliances in medieval history, combining Henry's administrative genius and military skill with Eleanor's cultural sophistication and extensive political connections. The peace negotiations that concluded the conflict established important precedents for the complex feudal relationships that would govern Henry and Eleanor's territories within the French kingdom. While technically acknowledging Louis as their feudal overlord for their French possessions, the Angevin rulers secured recognition of their practical independence in governing these territories. This arrangement satisfied legal requirements while preserving the autonomy necessary for effective administration of their far-flung domains. Eleanor's influence on Henry during the early months of their marriage was profound and lasting. Her sophisticated understanding of courtly culture and international diplomacy complemented his more practical focus on military affairs and administrative efficiency. She introduced him to intellectual currents and cultural movements that broadened his perspective and enhanced his effectiveness as a ruler. Most importantly, she provided him with insights into the complexities of governing diverse populations with different languages, customs, and political traditions. The marriage also provided Henry with crucial insights into the challenges he would face in governing territories that had not been shaped by Norman administrative practices. Aquitaine's political culture was markedly different from what he had known in Normandy and Anjou, requiring different approaches to maintaining authority and securing cooperation from local elites. Eleanor's guidance in navigating these complexities would prove invaluable throughout their marriage. By the end of 1152, the strategic implications of Henry and Eleanor's union were becoming clear to observers throughout Europe. The young Angevin prince had transformed himself from a regional power with limited resources into a ruler whose territories rivaled those of kings and emperors. More importantly, his marriage had provided him with the financial resources and political connections necessary to mount a serious challenge for the English throne that remained his ultimate objective. The foundation for the Angevin Empire had been laid through a combination of inheritance, conquest, and strategic marriage. Now the time was approaching when Henry would need to test his enlarged power base against the ultimate prize, the crown of England, that had been denied to his family for nearly 2 decades. The boy who had been born into civil war was ready to end it decisively in his own favor. As the year 1153 dawned, 19-year-old Henry possessed territorial holdings and military resources that made him one of the most powerful rulers in Western Europe. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine had created an Angevin Empire stretching from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees, commanding wealth and strategic advantages that no English king had enjoyed since the Norman conquest. More importantly, the time had arrived when England's seemingly endless civil war might finally be brought to a decisive conclusion through negotiation, rather than continued bloodshed. The strategic situation that Henry faced when he prepared to cross the English Channel was fundamentally different from what had confronted his mother Matilda 2 decades earlier. Stephen's position, once seemingly unassailable, had been weakened by years of conflict and the gradual erosion of his support among the English nobility. The king was aging, his health was declining, and many of his earlier supporters had begun to question whether his cause could ever achieve permanent victory over the Angevin claimants. Perhaps most significantly, the English kingdom itself was exhausted by nearly 20 years of civil war. The economic prosperity and administrative efficiency that had characterized Henry I's reign had been replaced by chaos and uncertainty that served no one's interests except those of opportunistic warlords and brigands. Many nobles who had initially supported Stephen from conviction or self-interest had come to recognize that continued conflict threatened their own long-term prosperity and security. The military force that Henry assembled for what would prove to be his final campaign in England reflected both his enhanced resources and his sophisticated understanding of the political challenges he faced. Rather than relying primarily on foreign mercenaries whose presence might alienate potential English supporters, Henry recruited extensively from among the Norman and Angevin nobles who had served his family for generations. These men brought not only military skills, but also political legitimacy, representing continuity with the administrative traditions that had served England well under Henry III. The campaign that followed Henry's landing in England demonstrated his maturation from promising student to accomplished strategist. Instead of attempting to achieve total military victory over Stephen's forces, Henry focused on demonstrating his strength while creating opportunities for negotiated settlement. His operations were carefully designed to minimize destruction while maximizing political impact, showing potential supporters that he possessed both the power to reward loyalty and the wisdom to use that power responsibly. Stephen's response to Henry's invasion revealed the weakness of his position more clearly than any battlefield defeat could have accomplished. The aging king's attempts to raise sufficient forces to confront the Angevin claimant met with limited success, as many of his traditional supporters either remained neutral or quietly began exploring accommodations with Henry's cause. Those nobles who did rally to Stephen's banner often did so half-heartedly, more concerned with protecting their own interests than with achieving decisive victory for their nominal leader. The military encounters that occurred during Henry's 1153 campaign were notably different in character from the bitter conflicts that had characterized earlier phases of the Civil War. Both sides seemed to recognize that the time for such destructive warfare had passed, and engagements were often concluded with negotiations rather than decisive battles. This shift in approach reflected growing war weariness among the English nobility and their recognition that compromise might serve everyone's interests better than continued conflict. Behind the scenes, a complex network of diplomatic communications had emerged, involving not only Henry and Stephen, but also influential nobles and church leaders who were eager to see the Civil War concluded on terms that would preserve their own positions while restoring stability to the kingdom. These negotiations required extraordinary delicacy, as any premature disclosure might have destroyed the fragile trust necessary for successful conclusion of the conflict. The death of Stephen's eldest son Eustace in August 1153 fundamentally altered the political calculations governing the succession struggle. Eustace had been his father's designated heir and the focus of hopes for continuing the line of succession that had begun with Stephen's usurpation in 1135. His sudden death from illness removed the primary obstacle to negotiated settlement, as Stephen was now forced to consider arrangements that might have been unthinkable while he still hoped to establish a dynasty. The psychological impact of Eustace's death on Stephen was enormous and immediately apparent to all who observed him. The aging king had invested enormous emotional energy in securing his son's inheritance, and the collapse of these hopes seemed to drain him of the will to continue fighting. For the first time since 1135, Stephen began to give serious consideration to arrangements that would recognize Henry's claims while preserving his own dignity and position. The formal negotiations that led to the Treaty of Winchester were conducted at the highest levels of English society, involving not only the two claimants, but also the most influential nobles and church leaders in the kingdom. The complexity of the arrangements that emerged from these discussions reflected the need to balance competing interests while creating a framework for stable government that could command widespread support. The treaty's central provision was elegantly simple. Stephen would remain as King of England for the remainder of his life, but he would recognize Henry as his heir and successor. This arrangement satisfied Stephen's need to preserve his dignity while acknowledging the reality of Henry's superior claim and resources. More importantly, it provided a framework for peaceful transition that could end the civil war without requiring either side to admit complete defeat. But the treaty also included numerous detailed provisions designed to address the complex practical problems that had emerged during 2 decades of conflict. Questions of property rights, military obligations, and administrative authority needed to be resolved before stable government could be restored. The careful attention paid to these issues reflected the negotiators' understanding that lasting peace required more than simple agreements about succession. It demanded comprehensive arrangements that could address the legitimate concerns of all parties. The ceremony at which the treaty was formally concluded was carefully designed to emphasize reconciliation and the restoration of legitimate authority. Stephen's public recognition of Henry as his heir was witnessed by the greatest nobles and prelates of the kingdom, lending the arrangement maximum authority and legitimacy. Henry's gracious acceptance of Stephen's continued kingship demonstrated his statesmanship and helped convince wavering observers that he possessed the character necessary for effective rule. The immediate aftermath of the treaty's conclusion revealed how desperately England had needed such a resolution of its political crisis. The cessation of active hostilities allowed trade to resume, administrative systems to be restored, and normal legal processes to function once again. The relief felt throughout the kingdom was palpable, and both Stephen and Henry received credit for their wisdom in choosing negotiation over continued warfare. For Henry personally, the treaty represented the culmination of a 20-year struggle that had begun before his birth and shaped every aspect of his development. The boy who had been born into civil war had finally achieved recognition as England's rightful heir through a combination of military pressure, diplomatic skill, and simple perseverance. More importantly, he had demonstrated the political maturity necessary to conclude the conflict through compromise rather than total victory, showing potential subjects that his reign might bring the stability and prosperity they so desperately desired. As winter approached in 1153, England waited with anticipation and hope for the transition that the treaty had made inevitable. Stephen's advancing age and declining health made it clear that the wait would not be long, and preparations began throughout the kingdom for the accession of a new king, whose reign promised to restore the glory and prosperity of earlier times. The Anarchy was finally drawing to its close, and a new chapter in English history was about to begin. On October 25th, 1154, the death of King Stephen brought the long years of civil war to their definitive end. and placed the crown of England upon the head of 21-year-old Henry Plantagenet. The young king, who knelt to receive consecration at Westminster Abbey that December, was already the most powerful ruler in Western Europe, commanding territories that stretched from the mists of Scotland to the sun-baked plains of Gascony. But the creation of what historians would later call the Angevin Empire was only beginning, as Henry set about the monumental task of transforming a collection of disparate territories into a coherent and effectively governed realm. The sheer geographical scope of Henry's dominions presented challenges that no previous English king had faced. The core of his power lay in England, where he ruled as king by hereditary right and held the loyalty of nobles who had served his grandfather Henry I. But across the English Channel lay his continental possessions: Normandy, inherited from his mother's line; Anjou, Maine, and Touraine, inherited from his father; and Aquitaine and Gascony, acquired through his marriage to Eleanor. Each of these territories possessed its own laws, customs, languages, and political traditions, requiring different approaches to governance and different strategies for maintaining royal authority. The administrative system that Henry inherited in England was both his greatest asset and his most immediate challenge. Henry had created perhaps the most sophisticated governmental machinery in medieval Europe, with efficient financial systems, professional administrators, and legal procedures that were the envy of other kingdoms. But 19 years of civil war had severely damaged these institutions, leaving behind a patchwork of competing authorities, uncertain legal precedents, and financial chaos that threatened the stability of the entire realm. Henry's first priority was the restoration of royal authority throughout England, a task that required both diplomatic finesse and occasional displays of military force. The illegal castles that had proliferated during Stephen's reign needed to be destroyed or brought under royal control, while the private armies that many nobles had assembled for protection during the Civil War needed to be disbanded. This process of reasserting central authority was accomplished with remarkable speed and efficiency, reflecting both Henry's administrative skills and the war weariness that made most nobles eager for stable government. The financial restoration of the English crown proved equally complex, but ultimately more rewarding. Henry inherited royal revenues that had been severely depleted by the costs of civil war and the grants Stephen had been forced to make to secure political support. Through a combination of administrative reform, economic development, and careful financial management, Henry succeeded in not only restoring, but substantially increasing royal income. The wealth of England would provide the financial foundation necessary for governing his vast continental possessions and pursuing his ambitious political objectives. But England, however important, was only one component of Henry's emerging empire. The governance of his French territories required different approaches that took account of their distinct political cultures and their complex relationships with the French crown. As Duke of Normandy, Henry ruled over territories that had been shaped by nearly a century of Anglo-Norman administration and shared many institutional features with England. The integration of Norman and English governmental systems proceeded relatively smoothly, building upon existing connections and shared traditions. The government of Aquitaine presented far greater challenges, reflecting the distinctive political culture that Eleanor brought to their marriage. The duchy's noble families possessed ancient rights and privileges that they defended jealously against any attempts at administrative innovation. The troubadour culture that flourished under Eleanor's patronage created expectations of courtly magnificence and cultural sophistication that required different approaches to royal display and propaganda than were common in Henry's northern territories. Henry's solution to these challenges was characteristically innovative and practical. Rather than attempting to impose uniform administrative systems throughout his territories, he developed flexible approaches that respected local traditions while maintaining essential elements of royal authority. This policy of administrative diversity within political unity would become one of the hallmarks of Angevin government, allowing Henry to govern effectively despite the enormous geographical and cultural diversity of his empire. The military organization necessary to defend such vast territories required unprecedented coordination and resources. Henry inherited the finest heavy cavalry in Europe from his Norman ancestors, combined with the wealth necessary to maintain large numbers of professional soldiers and the administrative systems needed to coordinate their deployment across multiple theatres of operation. But the defence of an empire stretching from Scotland to Spain demanded more than traditional feudal levies. It required the development of new strategies and new institutions. Henry's approach to imperial defence emphasised strategic mobility and the development of a network of carefully positioned fortifications that could serve as bases for rapid military deployment. The great stone castles that he constructed or renovated throughout his territories were marvels of military engineering, incorporating the latest developments in siege warfare while serving as symbols of royal power that could be seen for miles across the surrounding countryside. These fortifications were not merely defensive, they were integral components of a comprehensive strategy for maintaining imperial unity. The economic foundations of the Angevin Empire were as impressive as his military capabilities. Henry's territories included some of the richest agricultural regions in Europe, the most important trade routes connecting northern and southern Europe, and access to crucial maritime commercial networks that linked the Atlantic world with the Mediterranean. The wealth generated by trade, agriculture, and industry provided the resources necessary to maintain the administrative and military apparatus required for imperial governance. Perhaps most importantly, Henry understood that imperial unity required more than military conquest and administrative efficiency. It demanded the creation of shared institutions and common legal frameworks that could bind together his diverse territories. The legal reforms that would become his greatest legacy began during these early years of his reign, as he recognized that uniform systems of justice could provide the institutional foundation for lasting imperial unity. The cultural dimensions of empire building were equally important in Henry's calculations. The court that he and Eleanor established moved constantly throughout their territories, bringing royal magnificence and cultural sophistication to regions that had previously known only local forms of patronage. This peripatetic court served multiple purposes. It allowed Henry to maintain personal contact with his various territories, demonstrated royal power throughout the empire, and helped create shared cultural experiences that transcended regional boundaries. The Church played a crucial role in Henry's imperial project, providing both institutional continuity and ideological justification for his rule. Henry's patronage of monastic foundations and cathedral schools helped create networks of educated administrators and loyal supporters throughout his territories. More importantly, his support for church reform and his promotion of learned clerics to positions of authority helped legitimize his rule in the eyes of contemporaries who understood royal authority in fundamentally religious terms. By the end of his first decade as king, Henry had succeeded in transforming a collection of inherited and acquired territories into something approaching a coherent empire. The administrative innovations, military reforms, and legal developments of these years provided the foundation for what would prove to be one of the most successful and enduring governmental systems in medieval Europe. But the very success of Henry's empire building would soon create new challenges, as the complex relationships within his own family began to threaten the unity he had worked so hard to establish. The empire that Henry had built was a remarkable achievement, unprecedented in its scope and sophisticated in its organization, but it was also an inherently fragile creation, dependent upon the personal authority and administrative genius of its creator for its continued existence. The question that would dominate the remainder of Henry's reign was whether the institutional foundations he had laid would prove strong enough to survive the political storms that were already beginning to gather on the horizon. Among all of Henry II's achievements as King of England, none would prove more lasting or influential than his systematic transformation of English law and judicial administration. When Henry ascended to the throne in 1154, England's legal system remained a chaotic patchwork of competing jurisdictions, inconsistent procedures, and arbitrary enforcement that reflected the fragmented political authority of the Civil War years. By the time of his death, 35 years later, he had created the foundation of a unified legal system whose principles would eventually spread throughout the English-speaking world and continue to influence jurisprudence into modern times. The legal chaos that Henry inherited was the product of centuries of overlapping jurisdictions and competing authorities. Anglo-Saxon law had never been entirely displaced by Norman innovations, while local customs varied dramatically from region to region throughout the kingdom. Church courts claimed jurisdiction over a vast range of matters involving clerical personnel or spiritual concerns, while baronial courts administered justice within their respective territories according to their own traditions and interests. The royal courts that had functioned effectively under Henry I had largely ceased to operate during the Civil War, leaving ordinary people with the little recourse against injustice or arbitrary power. This legal fragmentation was not merely a technical administrative problem. It was a fundamental obstacle to effective royal government and economic prosperity. Merchants could not predict what legal standards would govern their commercial transactions from one region to another. Property rights were uncertain and difficult to enforce. Criminal justice was inconsistent and often corrupted by local political considerations. The restoration of unified legal authority was essential not only for the maintenance of royal power, but for the general welfare of the kingdom. Henry's approach to legal reform was characteristically systematic and practical. Rather than attempting to impose entirely new legal principles upon his subjects, he sought to identify and codify the best elements of existing legal traditions while creating new procedures that could ensure consistent and efficient administration of justice throughout the kingdom. This conservative approach to legal innovation helped ensure that his reforms would be accepted by nobles and commoners alike, who could recognize familiar principles even within new institutional frameworks. The Assize of Clarendon, promulgated in 1166, stands as perhaps the most important single legal document of the medieval period. This comprehensive ordinance established standardized procedures for criminal prosecution that would serve as the foundation for all subsequent developments in English criminal law. Most significantly, it created the system of grand juries, groups of local citizens who were required under oath to report suspected criminals to royal officials, that represented a revolutionary departure from earlier methods of criminal prosecution. The innovation of the jury system was perhaps Henry's most important contribution to legal development. Earlier methods of determining guilt or innocence had relied primarily on trial by ordeal, trial by combat, or compurgation, procedures that mixed elements of religious faith with practical investigation in ways that often seemed arbitrary to modern observers. Henry's juries, by contrast, were based on the principle that local citizens were the best judges of facts concerning their neighbors' behavior, and that systematic inquiry under oath could provide more reliable determinations of guilt or innocence than supernatural intervention. The creation of a system of royal justices who traveled regularly throughout the kingdom on predetermined circuits was equally revolutionary in its implications for English governance. These itinerant justices carried with them the authority of the crown and the standardized procedures established by royal ordinance, ensuring that identical legal principles would be applied consistently throughout the realm. The records they maintained created an unprecedented archive of legal precedents that would serve as the foundation for the development of case law in later centuries. The possessory assizes that Henry established to deal with disputes over land ownership addressed one of the most pressing legal problems of his age. Medieval society was fundamentally based upon landholding, but the civil wars had created enormous confusion about rightful ownership and legitimate possession. Henry's assizes provided standardized procedures for resolving these disputes that emphasized recent possession rather than ancient claims, creating a practical system for dealing with property disputes that could be administered efficiently by royal courts. The Assize of Novel Disseisin, which dealt with cases of recent dispossession from land, was particularly important in establishing royal authority over property rights. Under this procedure, anyone who claimed to have been recently ejected from land could obtain a royal writ commanding a jury of local citizens to determine whether the dispossession had indeed occurred and whether it was justified by law. This system provided landholders with effective legal protection, while establishing the principle that property rights were ultimately subject to royal authority and protection. The development of standardized legal writs, formal documents that initiated legal proceedings, was another crucial element of Henry's legal reforms. These writs provided ordinary citizens with access to royal justice by creating simple, standardized procedures for bringing cases before royal courts. The writs were carefully designed to cover the most common types of legal disputes, while ensuring that cases would be handled according to consistent principles regardless of where they arose within the kingdom. Henry's legal reforms also addressed the complex relationships between different types of courts that had created so much confusion during the Civil War period. While he did not attempt to eliminate local courts entirely, he established clear principles governing which types of cases belonged in which jurisdictions. Most importantly, he asserted the supremacy of royal courts in all matters that affected the king's peace or involved disputes between his direct subjects. The Constitutions of Clarendon, enacted in 1164, represented Henry's most ambitious attempt to define the relationships between secular and ecclesiastical authority within his legal system. These 16 articles sought to restore what Henry claimed were the traditional relationships between church and crown that had existed during his grandfather's reign, while establishing clear procedures for dealing with cases that involved both secular and spiritual considerations. The constitutions would prove to be one of the most controversial aspects of Henry's legal reforms, ultimately leading to his tragic conflict with Thomas Becket. The financial implications of Henry's legal reforms were as important as their judicial consequences. The system of fees, fines, and amercements associated with royal justice provided substantial revenues to the crown, while creating incentives for consistent and efficient administration. The requirement that legal proceedings be initiated through the purchase of royal writs ensured that the expanding system of royal justice would be self-financing, while the predictable costs associated with legal proceedings made it possible for ordinary citizens to plan for the expenses of seeking justice. Perhaps most significantly, Henry's legal reforms established the principle that law should be common to all subjects of the crown, regardless of their social status or geographical location within the kingdom. This concept of common law that was literally common to the entire realm, represented a fundamental departure from the localized and fragmented legal traditions that had characterized earlier periods. The idea that identical legal principles should govern similar cases throughout the kingdom laid the foundation for concepts of equality before the law that would eventually become central to modern legal systems. The practical implementation of Henry's legal reforms required the development of an extensive bureaucracy of trained administrators, clerks, and legal specialists. The growth of this professional administrative class represented one of the most important social developments of Henry's reign, creating new opportunities for advancement based on merit rather than birth, while ensuring that the complex procedures of royal justice could be administered consistently throughout the kingdom. The long-term influence of Henry's legal innovations extended far beyond the boundaries of medieval England. The principles of jury trial, standardized procedures, and common law that he established would eventually be carried to every corner of the English-speaking world through colonization and conquest. Modern legal systems in countries as diverse as the United States, Canada, Australia, and India still reflect fundamental principles that can be traced directly to Henry's 12th century reforms. The creation of written records for legal proceedings was another revolutionary aspect of Henry's reforms that would have profound consequences for the development of English law. The systematic preservation of legal documents, court records, and administrative correspondence created an unprecedented archive that would serve as the foundation for the development of legal precedent in later centuries. These records also provide modern historians with detailed insights into the functioning of medieval society and government that would be impossible to obtain from any other source. But perhaps the most important legacy of Henry's legal reforms was the establishment of the principle that royal authority was best exercised through consistent application of known legal principles, rather than arbitrary displays of personal power. This concept of government under law, the idea that even kings were subject to established legal procedures and principles, would eventually develop into constitutional limitations on royal authority that fundamentally transformed the nature of English kingship. The success of Henry's legal reforms was evident in their immediate acceptance by his subjects and their continued development by his successors. Unlike many medieval administrative innovations that disappeared with their creators, Henry's legal system proved sufficiently flexible and effective to adapt to changing circumstances while preserving its essential principles. The expansion and refinement of common law procedures continued for centuries after Henry's death, building upon the foundations he had established. The social impact of Henry's legal reforms was equally profound. By providing ordinary citizens with reliable access to royal justice, the new legal system created unprecedented opportunities for social mobility and economic development. Merchants could engage in commercial transactions with confidence that their agreements would be enforced consistently. Property owners could invest in improvements knowing that their rights would be protected. The general increase in legal security that resulted from Henry's reforms contributed substantially to the economic prosperity that characterized the later medieval period. As Henry's reign progressed, it became increasingly clear that his legal innovations represented more than mere administrative efficiency. They constituted a fundamental transformation in the relationship between rulers and subjects that would influence political development throughout Europe. The principle that governmental authority should be exercised through established legal procedures rather than personal discretion would eventually become one of the defining characteristics of Western political thought. The codification and systematic organization of legal procedures also facilitated the development of legal education and professional legal practice. Universities began to offer formal instruction in English law, while a class of professional lawyers emerged to help ordinary citizens navigate the increasingly complex procedures of royal justice. This professionalization of legal practice contributed to the continued development and refinement of legal principles, while ensuring that the system could adapt to new circumstances and challenges. Henry's legal legacy was not without its critics and limitations. The expansion of royal jurisdiction inevitably reduced the authority of local courts and traditional legal procedures, creating tensions that would persist for generations. The complexity of some legal procedures made them inaccessible to the poorest members of society, while the emphasis on written documentation favored those who could afford professional legal assistance. Nevertheless, even contemporary critics acknowledge that Henry's legal system represented a substantial improvement over the arbitrary and inconsistent justice that had characterized earlier periods. The enduring influence of Henry's legal reforms serves as perhaps the clearest demonstration of his administrative genius and his understanding of the fundamental requirements for effective governance. By creating legal institutions that could function effectively regardless of the personal qualities of individual rulers, Henry established foundations for political stability that would serve England well through centuries of political upheaval and social change. The common law that emerged from his reforms became one of England's most important exports to the wider world, shaping legal development in dozens of countries and contributing to the emergence of modern concepts of individual rights and governmental accountability. In the midst of his revolutionary legal reforms and the complex challenges of governing his vast empire, Henry II found time to build a family life that was remarkable for both its size and its ultimate tragedy. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine proved extraordinarily fertile, producing 8 children who survived infancy in an age when such survival was far from assured. Yet the very success of their procreative partnership would eventually become the source of Henry's greatest sorrows, as his efforts to provide for his numerous offspring created conflicts that would tear apart both his family and his empire. Eleanor's first pregnancy after their marriage was closely watched throughout Europe, as the political implications of their union would be determined largely by their ability to produce male heirs. The birth of their first son William in 1153 was greeted with celebration throughout the Angevin territories, as it seemed to guarantee the continuation of Henry's dynasty. But tragedy struck early when the infant prince died before reaching his second birthday, a loss that deeply affected both parents and reminded them of the precarious nature of medieval childhood. The birth of Henry the young king in 1155 restored hopes for dynastic continuity, while establishing a pattern that would characterize the royal family for the next decade. Eleanor proved remarkably successful at producing healthy children who survived the dangerous early years of life, an achievement that reflected both good fortune and the excellent medical care available to the royal family. By 1166, she had given birth to 7 more children: Matilda in 1156, Richard in 1157, Geoffrey in 1158, Eleanor in 1161, Joan in 1165, and John in 1166. The survival of so many royal children was unprecedented in medieval Europe, where infant mortality rates often exceeded 50% even among the nobility. Eleanor's success as a mother enhanced her political standing while providing Henry with the luxury of multiple male heirs, a situation that seemed to guarantee dynastic stability, but would ultimately prove to be a source of devastating conflict. Each surviving son represented both an asset and a potential problem, requiring careful management to prevent fraternal competition from destroying the empire their father had built. Henry the young king, as the eldest surviving son, naturally occupied a special position within the family hierarchy. His birth had coincided with Henry's emergence as a serious claimant to the English throne, making the young prince both a symbol of dynastic legitimacy and a valuable diplomatic asset. His betrothal to Margaret of France, daughter of Louis VII, was arranged when he was barely 5 years old, cementing an important alliance while providing Louis with some hope of influencing the succession to Henry's territories. Richard, born 2 years after his elder brother, would ultimately prove to be the most militarily gifted of Henry's sons. Even as a child, he displayed the physical courage and aggressive temperament that would eventually earn him the sobriquet Lionheart, His identification with his mother's Aquitanian inheritance was evident from early childhood, as Eleanor clearly favoured this son who seemed to embody the martial virtues that her duchy prized above all others. Geoffrey, born in 1158, was named for Henry's father and seemed destined for a significant role within the Angevin political system. His eventual marriage to Constance of Brittany would bring that important duchy more firmly under Angevin control, while providing Geoffrey with territories appropriate to his status as a royal son. But Geoffrey would also prove to be one of the most politically astute and potentially dangerous of Henry's children, combining genuine ability with an ambitious nature that would cause his father considerable concern. John, the youngest son, born in 1166, entered a world where his elder brothers had already established their positions within the family hierarchy. The nickname Lackland that he acquired during childhood reflected the difficulty of providing appropriate territories for a fourth surviving son, but it also marked him as potentially dependent upon his father's favour in ways that his brothers were not. This dependence would eventually make John both his father's favourite and his most dangerous potential ally. The three daughters, Matilda, Eleanor and Joan, were equally valuable as diplomatic assets, though their futures would be determined primarily by the marriage alliances their parents arranged for them. Matilda's marriage to Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony, strengthened Angevin connections with the Holy Roman Empire, while Eleanor's marriage to Alfonso VIII of Castile extended Henry's influence into the Iberian Peninsula. Joan's eventual marriage to William II of Sicily would give the Angevin family important connections in the Mediterranean world. The education of so many royal children presented unprecedented challenges and opportunities. Henry was determined that his sons should receive the finest education available, combining classical learning with practical training in the skills they would need as rulers. Each prince was assigned his own household and tutors, while their sisters received the education in languages, literature, and courtly accomplishments that would prepare them for their roles as queens and duchesses. The question of how to provide appropriate territories and responsibilities for multiple adult sons had no clear precedent in medieval practice. Previous English kings had typically faced the opposite problem of insufficient male heirs, while continental rulers with numerous sons had often seen their territories fragmented through partible inheritance. Henry's solution was characteristically innovative, but ultimately problematic. He would divide his territories among his sons, while retaining ultimate authority over their actions. This arrangement satisfied no one completely. The young princes chafed under their father's continued control, while Henry worried about the potential for fraternal conflict if he granted them genuine independence. The problem was compounded by the different political cultures of Henry's various territories, which created different expectations about the relationships between fathers and adult sons. What seemed reasonable in Norman political culture might appear tyrannical by Aquitanian standards, while arrangements that satisfied English expectations might prove inadequate for maintaining authority in Anjou. The involvement of Eleanor in these family dynamics added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. As Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, Eleanor possessed independent political authority that gave her influence over her children's futures that extended beyond traditional maternal roles. Her particular favoritism toward Richard, who was clearly destined to inherit Aquitaine, created tensions with Henry's preference for more equal treatment of all their sons. The peripatetic nature of Henry's court meant that the royal family was constantly travelling throughout the Angevin territories, providing the children with unprecedented exposure to the diversity of their inheritance. This mobility had educational advantages, as each prince learned about the different political cultures and administrative systems he might eventually govern. But it also meant that family relationships were often strained by the practical demands of governing a far-flung empire. The Christmas courts that Henry and Eleanor held at different locations throughout their territories became important occasions for family reunification and political display. These elaborate celebrations demonstrated royal magnificence, while providing opportunities for the royal children to interact with the nobles and administrators who served their parents. The careful choreography of these events reflected Henry's understanding that royal family relationships were inevitably political relationships as well. As the royal children reached adolescence and young adulthood, the question of their future roles became increasingly pressing. Henry's efforts to provide them with appropriate responsibilities while maintaining his own authority created a delicate balance that required constant adjustment. The success or failure of these arrangements would ultimately determine not only the fate of individual family members, but the survival of the Angevin Empire itself. The irony of Henry's family situation was that his very success in producing numerous healthy heirs had created problems that less fortunate rulers never faced. The abundance that should have been his greatest blessing would eventually become the source of his greatest sorrows, as the children he loved proved unable to accept the constraints he felt necessary to impose upon them. The stage was being set for family conflicts that would dominate the remainder of Henry's reign and ultimately contribute to his tragic end. Among all the relationships that shaped Henry II's reign, none proved more consequential or tragic than his friendship with Thomas Becket, a relationship that began in mutual admiration and practical cooperation, but ended in murder, scandal, and lasting stain upon Henry's reputation. The story of their association illuminates not only the personal character of both men, but also the fundamental tensions between secular and spiritual authority that defined medieval political culture. From the moment Henry elevated his trusted chancellor to become Archbishop of Canterbury, the seeds of conflict were sown that would eventually destroy both their friendship and Becket's life. Thomas Becket's origins were remarkably humble for a man who would rise to become one of the most powerful figures in 12th century Europe. Born around 1120 in Cheapside, in the commercial heart of London, he was the son of Gilbert Becket, a prosperous merchant who had immigrated to England from Normandy following William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings. The family was neither particularly wealthy nor well-connected, belonging to that emerging class of urban merchants who were beginning to play increasingly important roles in England's expanding commercial economy. Despite his modest origins, Thomas displayed exceptional intellectual gifts from an early age. His parents recognized their son's potential and invested heavily in his education, sending him first to Merton Priory and later to Paris, where he studied at the Cathedral schools that represented the pinnacle of medieval learning. His academic brilliance, combined with his natural charisma and administrative skills, soon attracted the attention of influential patrons who would prove instrumental in his meteoric rise through the ranks of the English church hierarchy. Theobald of Bec, who served as Archbishop of Canterbury from 1139 to 1161, emerged as Thomas's most important early patron. Recognizing the young man's exceptional abilities, Theobald brought him into his household as a clerk and gradually entrusted him with increasingly important responsibilities. Thomas's efficiency, discretion, and loyalty made him indispensable to the Archbishop, while his charm and sophistication enabled him to navigate successfully the complex world of high ecclesiastical politics. When Henry ascended to the throne in 1154, he inherited a kingdom whose administrative machinery had been severely damaged by 20 years of civil war. The restoration of effective government required talented administrators who could be trusted with important responsibilities, and Theobald's recommendation of his protege Thomas Becket proved to be one of the most fateful personnel decisions in English history. Henry's appointment of Thomas as Lord Chancellor of England in 1155 marked the beginning of a partnership that would revolutionize English government while sowing the seeds of future tragedy. The friendship that developed between the young king and his chancellor was remarkable for its intimacy and mutual respect. Despite their different backgrounds, Henry, the scion of royal dynasties, Thomas, the son of London merchants, the two men discovered shared interests, compatible temperaments, and complementary skills that made their working relationship extraordinarily effective. Thomas's administrative genius provided the practical expertise that Henry needed to govern his vast territories, while Henry's political vision and royal authority gave Thomas the power to implement reforms on an unprecedented scale. Their personal friendship extended far beyond official duties, as contemporary chroniclers recorded with fascination and sometimes disapproval. Henry and Thomas hunted together, dined together, and even shared sleeping quarters during their travels, a level of intimacy that was unusual between a king and his subject. Thomas's luxurious lifestyle, maintained with wealth derived from his position as chancellor, rivaled that of the greatest nobles, while his wit and erudition made him a valued companion for a king who prided himself on his intellectual accomplishments. The success of their partnership was evident in the remarkable efficiency with which royal government functioned during Thomas's tenure as chancellor. Royal revenues increased substantially through improved collection methods and administrative reforms. The legal system that Henry was developing received crucial support from Thomas's organizational skills and attention to detail. Military campaigns were supplied and coordinated with unprecedented effectiveness. By every measurable standard, the collaboration between king and chancellor was producing results that surpassed the achievements of previous English administrations. Thomas's loyalty to Henry during these years was absolute and sometimes controversial. When Henry's policies conflicted with church interests, Thomas consistently supported his royal master rather than his ecclesiastical colleagues. His willingness to subordinate church concerns to royal policy made him unpopular among some clergy, but confirmed Henry's confidence in his chancellor's devotion to the crown. This pattern of behavior would make Thomas's later transformation all the more shocking and incomprehensible to the king, who had trusted him completely. The death of Archbishop Theobald in April 1161 created a vacancy that Henry viewed as an opportunity to extend his control over the English Church through the appointment of a loyal and capable successor. His decision to nominate Thomas for the position seemed entirely logical from a political perspective. Who better to serve as Archbishop than the man who had demonstrated unwavering loyalty as Chancellor and possessed the administrative skills necessary to govern the complex ecclesiastical hierarchy? But Thomas's initial reaction to Henry's proposal suggested depths to his character that the king had not previously suspected. According to several contemporary accounts, Thomas warned Henry that his elevation to the archbishopric might change their relationship in ways that neither man could anticipate. "Should God permit me to be Archbishop of Canterbury," Thomas allegedly told Henry, "I would soon lose your Majesty's favour, and the affection with which you honour me would be changed into hatred, for there are several things you do against the liberty of the Church which make me fear you would require of me what I could not agree to." Henry dismissed these concerns as excessive scrupulosity, confident that their personal friendship and Thomas's proven loyalty would ensure continued cooperation regardless of the formal changes in their relationship. The king's faith in his chancellor's character seemed vindicated when Thomas accepted the nomination and was duly elected by the Canterbury chapter in May 1162. His consecration as Archbishop in June of that year was attended by Henry himself, who participated enthusiastically in the ceremonies that elevated his friend to the highest ecclesiastical office in England. The transformation that occurred in Thomas's behavior following his consecration was so dramatic and complete that it seemed to contemporaries almost supernatural in its scope. The man who had lived in luxury as Chancellor immediately adopted the austere lifestyle of a reformed monk, wearing hair shirts beneath his magnificent ecclesiastical robes and engaging in severe personal mortification. The royal servant, who had consistently subordinated church interest to royal policy, suddenly became a zealous defender of ecclesiastical privileges and papal authority. This transformation was not merely external or ceremonial. It reflected a fundamental reorientation of Thomas's priorities and loyalties that would govern all his subsequent actions. The administrative skills that had served Henry so effectively were now deployed in defense of church interests, while the personal charm that had made Thomas such an effective royal agent was redirected toward building support among clergy who had previously viewed him with suspicion. Most significantly, the absolute loyalty that Thomas had shown to Henry was transferred to the church and its claims to independence from secular authority. The first serious conflicts between Henry and Thomas emerged within months of the latter's consecration as Archbishop. In August 1163, at a royal council meeting at Woodstock, Henry proposed converting a traditional payment made by sheriffs to archbishops into a royal tax that would be collected directly by the crown. This seemingly technical financial matter represented exactly the sort of administrative rationalization that Thomas had previously supported as Chancellor, but as Archbishop, he vehemently opposed any reduction in ecclesiastical revenues or independence. The confrontation at Woodstock revealed the complete transformation in Thomas's attitude toward his former master and friend. When Henry demanded that the payment be made directly to royal officials, Thomas replied with unmistakable firmness, "By the reverence of the eyes by which you have sworn, my Lord King, there shall be given from all my land, or from the property of the church, not a penny." Henry's furious response, "By the eyes of God, it shall be given as revenue and entered in the royal rolls," marked the first open break between the two men who had once been inseparable companions. This initial conflict established a pattern that would characterize all subsequent interactions between Henry and Thomas. The king would propose measures designed to rationalize the administration of his kingdom and increase royal authority, while the archbishop would resist any encroachment on what he considered the rightful privileges and independence of the church. Each man's position was logically consistent with his institutional responsibilities, but their conflicting loyalties made compromise increasingly difficult to achieve. The personal dimension of their conflict made it particularly bitter and intractable. Henry felt betrayed by a man he had elevated from obscurity and trusted completely, while Thomas believed that his loyalty to God and the Church required him to oppose his former friend and benefactor. The intimacy of their previous relationship made every disagreement a personal wound, while their public positions prevented either man from backing down without losing face before their respective supporters. The conflict escalated throughout 1163 and early 1164, as Henry attempted to reassert royal authority over various aspects of ecclesiastical administration, while Thomas defended traditional church privileges with increasing militancy. The question of clerical immunity from secular justice became the central issue dividing them, as Henry demanded the right to prosecute criminal clergy in royal courts, while Thomas insisted that such cases belonged exclusively to ecclesiastical jurisdiction. This dispute reflected fundamental disagreements about the proper relationship between church and state that had profound implications for the governance of medieval kingdoms. Henry's patience with his former friend's opposition finally expired in early 1164, when he summoned a great council at Clarendon and demanded that Thomas accept a comprehensive statement of the traditional relationships between royal and ecclesiastical authority. The constitutions of Clarendon represented Henry's most systematic attempt to define these relationships in ways that would prevent future conflicts while asserting royal supremacy in crucial areas of governance. But for Thomas, acceptance of the constitutions would have meant abandoning his understanding of the Church's divinely mandated independence from secular control. The confrontation at Clarendon marked the point of no return in the relationship between Henry and Thomas. After initially appearing to accept the constitutions under enormous pressure from both the king and his fellow bishops, Thomas quickly repudiated his agreement and declared his opposition to any limitations on ecclesiastical independence. This apparent duplicity infuriated Henry and convinced him that Thomas was fundamentally untrustworthy, while Thomas's supporters viewed his change of heart as evidence of his unwavering commitment to principle despite personal cost. The breakdown of their relationship became complete when Thomas fled England in November 1164, seeking refuge at the papal court and beginning a 6-year exile that would embitter both men and create international complications for Henry's reign. The Archbishop's flight transformed a domestic political dispute into an international crisis involving the Pope, the French king, and various other European rulers who had their own reasons for opposing Henry's expansion of royal authority. The personal friendship that had once seemed so valuable to both men had become the source of a conflict that threatened the stability of Henry's entire empire. The 6 years of Thomas Becket's exile had been marked by increasing bitterness on both sides, failed negotiations, and the gradual transformation of what had begun as a political dispute into a personal vendetta that consumed both men's energies and dominated European diplomacy. By 1170, the conflict between Henry II and his former friend had reached such intensity that it threatened to undermine Henry's relationships with the Pope, the French king, and his own subjects. The pressure for reconciliation had become irresistible, but the deep wounds inflicted during their long estrangement would prove impossible to heal completely. The negotiations that led to Thomas's return to England were conducted through intermediaries, as the two former friends could no longer bear to communicate directly with each other. Pope Alexander III, King Louis VII of France, and various English nobles worked tirelessly to find a formula that would allow Thomas to resume his archiepiscopal duties while preserving Henry's essential authority over the English Church. The agreement that was finally reached in July 1170 appeared to offer hope for genuine reconciliation, but it left many crucial issues unresolved and failed to address the deep personal animosity that had developed between the two men. The terms of Thomas's restoration were deliberately ambiguous, reflecting the negotiators' understanding that excessive precision might have made agreement impossible. Thomas would be restored to all his dignities and revenues as Archbishop of Canterbury, while Henry would receive a general promise that the Archbishop would serve him faithfully as his predecessors had served earlier kings. This vague language allowed both sides to interpret the agreement according to their own preferences, but it also ensured that future conflicts were virtually inevitable. Thomas's return to England on December 1st, 1170, was marked by scenes of popular enthusiasm that demonstrated his continued appeal to ordinary English subjects who viewed him as a champion of religious principles against royal tyranny. Crowds of common people lined the roads to Canterbury to welcome their returning archbishop, while church bells rang throughout the countryside to celebrate his homecoming. This outpouring of popular support was both gratifying to Thomas and ominous for Henry, as it suggested that the archbishop's cause had acquired a popular dimension that transcended the ecclesiastical politics that had originally motivated his resistance. But even as Thomas was being welcomed back to England by enthusiastic crowds, he was taking actions that would make renewed conflict with Henry inevitable. Before leaving France, the Archbishop had prepared letters of excommunication against Roger of York, Gilbert Folliot of London, and Jocelyn of Salisbury. 3 bishops who had participated in the controversial coronation of Henry the Young King during Thomas's absence from England. This coronation had violated the traditional prerogative of Canterbury to crown English kings, and Thomas was determined to punish those who had participated in what he considered a deliberate insult to his dignity and authority. The delivery of these excommunication letters coincided with Thomas's arrival in England, ensuring that his return would be marked by controversy rather than reconciliation. The 3 bishops immediately appealed to Henry for protection, while Thomas refused all suggestions that he should moderate his position in the interests of preserving the fragile peace that had been negotiated. The Archbishop's inflexibility on this issue convinced many observers that he was more interested in asserting his authority than in achieving genuine reconciliation with his king. Henry's reaction to news of the excommunications was predictably explosive. The king was spending Christmas at his castle in Bures, Normandy, when messengers arrived with reports of Thomas's actions. According to various contemporary accounts, Henry flew into one of the terrible rages that had become legendary throughout his dominions, denouncing Thomas as an ingrate who had repaid royal favour with treachery and defiance. The exact words that Henry spoke during this outburst would become a matter of historical controversy, but their general import was unmistakable. The most commonly reported version of Henry's outburst was recorded by Edward Grimm, who claimed that the king cried out, "What miserable drones and traitors have I nourished and brought up in my household, who let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born cleric?" Other chroniclers reported slightly different versions of these fatal words, but all agreed that Henry had expressed his frustration in language that could be interpreted as a call for violent action against Thomas. Whether the king intended his words to be taken as a direct command for murder would remain forever unclear, but their effect upon his listeners was immediate and decisive. 4 knights who were present at Henry's court when he delivered his angry denunciation took his words as a royal command that required immediate action. Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton were all experienced warriors who had served Henry faithfully in various military campaigns. Their decision to act upon what they interpreted as the king's wishes reflected both their loyalty to Henry and their understanding of how such loyalty was expected to manifest itself in the brutal world of medieval politics. The 4 knights left Henry's court secretly, making no announcement of their intentions to the king or anyone else. This secrecy would later allow Henry to claim that he had not authorized their actions, but it also meant that no one was in a position to prevent the tragedy that was about to unfold. The knights travelled to England by different routes to avoid attracting attention, arranging to meet at Saltwood Castle in Kent, which belonged to one of Thomas's enemies and could provide them with a secure base for their operations. Their journey to Canterbury on December 29th, 1170, was undertaken with careful planning designed to maximize their chances of success while minimizing the risk of interference from Thomas's supporters. They left their weapons and armor at Saltwood Castle, approaching the cathedral in ordinary dress to avoid arousing suspicion. This decision to appear as peaceful visitors rather than armed warriors would prove crucial in enabling them to gain access to Thomas without encountering significant resistance from his household. The confrontation between the 4 knights and Thomas Becket in the cathedral at Canterbury has been described in vivid detail by several eyewitnesses, whose accounts provide an extraordinarily complete picture of the final moments of one of medieval England's most famous figures. The knights found Thomas in the cathedral preparing for Vespers, surrounded by a small group of clerks and monks who comprised his regular household. The Archbishop's initial reaction to their arrival was one of resignation rather than surprise, as if he had long expected that his conflict with Henry would eventually lead to such a moment. The knight's first demand was that Thomas should absolve the 3 bishops whom he had excommunicated, thus removing the immediate cause of Henry's anger and perhaps avoiding the need for violence. But Thomas's response was characteristically uncompromising, as he declared that he would not absolve men who had acted against the dignity of Canterbury and the authority of the Church. This refusal eliminated any possibility of peaceful resolution and confirmed the knight's understanding that only extreme measures could resolve the crisis that Thomas's intransigence had created. What followed was one of the most shocking crimes in medieval history, as the 4 knights brutally murdered the Archbishop of Canterbury at the altar of his own cathedral during the celebration of Vespers. The details of the killing, as recorded by eyewitness accounts, were horrific in their brutality and made all the more appalling by their sacred setting. Thomas made no attempt to flee or defend himself, instead accepting his fate with a dignity that impressed even his killers and ensured that he would be remembered as a martyr rather than merely as a victim of political violence. Edward Grimm, who was wounded while attempting to protect Thomas, provided the most detailed account of the Archbishop's final moments. According to Grimm's testimony, Thomas commended his cause to God and accepted death for the name of Jesus and in defense of the Church, displaying a courage and faith that immediately convinced observers that they were witnessing the martyrdom of a saint. The Archbishop's last words and his manner of dying transformed what might have been remembered as a sordid political murder into a spiritual triumph that would inspire Christians for centuries to come. The immediate aftermath of the murder revealed the magnitude of the crime that had been committed. The cathedral clergy and the citizens of Canterbury were horrified by what they had witnessed, while the 4 knights themselves seemed stunned by the enormity of their actions. Word of the Archbishop's death spread rapidly throughout England and across the English Channel to the continent, creating waves of shock and revulsion that reached every corner of Christian Europe. The murder of an archbishop in his own cathedral during divine service represented a sacrilege so profound that it challenged the very foundations of medieval Christian civilization. News of Thomas's death reached Henry at his Norman court within days of the murder, and the king's reaction provided convincing evidence that he had not intended for his angry words to be interpreted as a command for assassination. Henry's grief and horror were apparently genuine, as he immediately began the elaborate process of public penance that medieval Christian culture demanded from those who bore responsibility for such crimes. The king's subsequent actions would demonstrate his desperate desire to distance himself from the murder while acknowledging his indirect responsibility for creating the circumstances that had made it inevitable. The transformation of Thomas Becket from controversial archbishop to martyred saint occurred with unprecedented rapidity, as reports of miracles at his tomb began to circulate within days of his death. Pilgrims flocked to Canterbury to pray at the site where he had died, while church authorities began the process that would lead to his canonization by Pope Alexander III in 1173. The speed of this canonization reflected both the obvious sanctity of Thomas's death and the political advantages that the Church could gain by establishing the murdered archbishop as an official saint, whose cult would serve as a permanent reminder of the dangers of royal tyranny. The murder in Canterbury Cathedral marked the end of one of the most significant personal relationships in medieval history, while creating problems for Henry II that would plague the remainder of his reign. The king, who had begun his rule with such promise, had now become associated with one of the most shocking crimes of his age, a stain upon his reputation that no amount of subsequent penance could entirely remove. The friendship that had once seemed so valuable to both men had ended in blood, scandal, and lasting damage to the cause of effective royal government that Henry had worked so hard to advance. While the conflict with Thomas Becket dominated European attention during the 1160s, Henry II was simultaneously pursuing another ambitious project that would have profound and lasting consequences for the British Isles. The Norman conquest of Ireland, which began as a private venture by Welsh adventurers but ultimately became a systematic royal enterprise, represented one of the most significant expansions of English power during the medieval period. The success of this conquest not only provided Henry with valuable new territories, but also established patterns of English involvement in Irish affairs that would persist for more than 7 centuries. Ireland in the 12th century remained largely untouched by the administrative and military innovations that had transformed England and much of continental Europe. During the preceding century, the island was divided among numerous competing kingdoms, each ruled by kings who claimed ancient rights and contested boundaries with their neighbors through constant warfare. This political fragmentation had prevented the development of the unified governmental institutions that characterized more advanced medieval kingdoms, while the absence of significant stone fortifications made Irish rulers particularly vulnerable to the new military technologies that Norman adventurers brought with them. The immediate cause of Norman intervention in Ireland was a succession dispute within the Kingdom of Leinster that created opportunities for ambitious outsiders to play decisive roles in Irish politics. Dermot mac Murchada, who had ruled Leinster since 1126, was expelled from his kingdom in 1166 by a coalition of his Irish enemies, led by Ruaidhrí Ua Conchobar, the High King of Ireland. Mac Murchada's attempts to regain his throne through traditional Irish military methods proved unsuccessful, leading him to seek help from the powerful Norman lords who controlled much of Wales along the Irish Sea. Mac Murchada's journey to Henry II's court in France marked the beginning of a process that would fundamentally alter the political structure of the British Isles. The Irish king's request for military assistance came at a time when Henry was preoccupied with his conflict with Thomas Becket and his complex relationships with Louis VII of France. While Henry was unwilling to commit royal resources to what appeared to be a local Irish dispute, he was prepared to authorize private military ventures by his subjects who might be able to serve their own interests while advancing broader Angevin goals. The response to Mac Murchada's appeal came primarily from the Cambro-Norman lords of Wales, men who had grown wealthy and powerful through their conquest of Welsh territories, but who were now seeking new opportunities for military adventure and territorial expansion. These lords possessed the advanced military technology, administrative experience, and political connections necessary for successful intervention in Irish affairs, while their familiarity with Celtic political culture gave them important advantages in understanding and manipulating Irish political relationships. Richard de Clare, Earl of Pembroke, emerged as the most significant figure in the Norman response to Mac Murchada's request for assistance. Known by the nickname Strongbow, Richard was a member of one of the most powerful Anglo-Norman families, but his position in Wales had been weakened by political changes that reduced his influence at Henry's court. The opportunity to establish himself as a major figure in Irish politics offered him the prospect of regaining political prominence while acquiring new sources of wealth and power. The agreement that Strongbow reached with Mac Murchada in 1168 established the framework for Norman intervention in Ireland, while creating personal relationships that would profoundly influence the subsequent course of Irish history. In exchange for his military assistance in restoring Mac Murchada to power in Leinster, Strongbow would receive the hand of Mac Murchada's daughter, Aoife, in marriage, and would be recognized as heir to the Kingdom of Leinster. This arrangement gave Strongbow both immediate political legitimacy and long-term prospects for territorial control that made the risks of military intervention acceptable. The Norman invasion of Ireland began in earnest in May 1169, when Robert Fitzstephen landed near Wexford with a small but well-equipped force of knights, archers, and men-at-arms. The military superiority of Norman forces was immediately apparent, as their heavy cavalry, crossbows, and siege techniques proved devastatingly effective against Irish armies that had not adapted to the new military technologies that had revolutionized European warfare during the previous century. Within weeks, Fitzstephen's forces had captured Wexford and established a secure foothold on the Irish coast. Strongbow's own landing in August 1170 marked the beginning of the systematic conquest of Eastern Ireland that would establish Norman control over the most valuable and strategically important portions of the island. His forces quickly captured Waterford, one of Ireland's most important commercial centres, before advancing on Dublin, the political heart of Irish power. The fall of Dublin to Norman forces in September 1170 effectively ended organised Irish resistance to the invasion and established Strongbow as the dominant political figure in Eastern Ireland. The success of the Norman conquest was facilitated not only by military superiority, but also by the political divisions among Irish rulers that prevented effective coordinated resistance. Many Irish kings viewed the Norman invasion primarily as an opportunity to settle old scores with their traditional enemies, rather than as a threat to Irish independence. This fragmented response enabled the relatively small Norman forces to achieve victories that would have been impossible against unified opposition. Macmurcheda's death in May 1171 transformed the legal and political basis of Norman presence in Ireland, as Strongbow now claimed the Kingdom of Leinster by right of marriage, rather than as a foreign ally supporting a legitimate Irish king. This change in legal status created new opportunities for Norman expansion, while raising questions about the relationship between the Norman conquest and traditional Irish political structures. More immediately, it alarmed Henry II, who recognized that his subjects' success in Ireland might create an independent power base that could challenge royal authority. Henry's decision to mount his own expedition to Ireland in 1171 reflected his understanding that the Norman conquest had succeeded beyond his original expectations and now required royal oversight to prevent the emergence of an overmighty subject. The king's intervention was designed to assert royal authority over the Norman conquerors, while extending English governmental systems to the newly conquered territories. This transformation of a private military adventure into a royal conquest had profound implications for the subsequent history of English involvement in Ireland. The royal expedition that landed at Waterford in October 1171 was impressive in its size and composition, demonstrating Henry's commitment to establishing permanent English control over Ireland. The king brought with him not only substantial military forces, but also the administrative personnel necessary for establishing governmental institutions modelled on those that had proved successful in England and Normandy. This comprehensive approach to conquest reflected Henry's understanding that military victory needed to be consolidated through effective administration if it was to produce lasting results. Henry's reception in Ireland exceeded his most optimistic expectations, as numerous Irish kings came to Dublin to submit to his authority and accept him as their overlord. This ready acceptance of English supremacy reflected both the effectiveness of Norman military power and the pragmatic calculations of Irish rulers who recognized that accommodation with the conquerors offered better prospects for preserving their local authority than continued resistance. The speed and completeness of these submissions enabled Henry to establish his claim to lordship over Ireland with minimal additional warfare. The ecclesiastical dimension of Henry's Irish conquest was equally important in legitimizing his presence on the island and establishing the institutional foundations for long-term English control. The Irish Church, which had developed distinctive practices and organizational structures during centuries of isolation from continental Christianity, was brought into conformity with Roman practices through a series of synods and administrative reforms. This ecclesiastical reorganization provided Henry with valuable support from church hierarchy, while extending English administrative methods to another crucial area of medieval governance. The Treaty of Windsor, negotiated in 1175 between Henry and Ruaidrí Ua Conchobar, established the formal legal framework for English rule in Ireland, while attempting to balance the claims of English conquerors with the rights of Irish rulers who had submitted to Henry's authority. Under the treaty's terms, Henry would exercise direct control over the eastern portion of Ireland that had been conquered by Norman forces, while Ruaidrí would continue to rule the western regions as Henry's vassal, and would be responsible for ensuring the submission and good behaviour of other Irish kings. This arrangement reflected Henry's characteristic preference for indirect rule that preserved local structures, while establishing ultimate English authority. The system worked reasonably well during Henry's lifetime, as the king's personal prestige and the continued threat of military intervention encouraged compliance with the treaty's provisions. However, the inherent tensions between English and Irish concepts of political authority would create ongoing problems for Henry's successors and contribute to the development of the complex and troubled relationship between England and Ireland that would persist for centuries. The long-term consequences of Henry's Irish conquest were far more significant than the immediate political and military advantages that it provided. The establishment of English lordship over Ireland created new sources of revenue and military recruitment that strengthened the Angevin Empire, while providing opportunities for advancement for English nobles and administrators. More importantly, the conquest established precedents for English intervention in Celtic political affairs that would influence subsequent English policy toward Wales and Scotland. The cultural impact of the Norman conquest was equally profound, as English governmental institutions, legal practices, and architectural styles were introduced throughout the conquered territories. The construction of stone castles and fortified towns transformed the Irish landscape, while providing visible symbols of English power that reinforced the political changes that had occurred. The introduction of English agricultural techniques and commercial practices contributed to economic development that benefited both English settlers and Irish subjects. The military lessons learned during the Irish conquest also influenced Henry's subsequent military and political strategies. The effectiveness of combined arms tactics that integrated heavy cavalry with archers and infantry was demonstrated clearly during the Irish campaigns, while the importance of maintaining secure supply lines and establishing strongpoints for defensive purposes was reinforced by practical experience. These lessons would prove valuable during Henry's later conflicts with his own sons and with the French monarchy. Perhaps most significantly, the Irish conquest demonstrated Henry's ability to extend his governmental innovations beyond the traditional boundaries of the Anglo-Norman realm, while adapting his administrative methods to different political and cultural contexts. The success of English rule in Ireland provided a model for territorial expansion that would influence subsequent English imperial ventures, while the integration of Irish resources with the broader Angevin Empire enhanced Henry's ability to pursue his ambitious political objectives on the European continent. By the end of the 1170s, Henry's Irish lordship had become an integral component of the Angevin Empire, providing both resources and strategic advantages that strengthened his position in his ongoing conflicts with France and his domestic political challenges. The conquest that had begun as a limited intervention in Irish succession disputes had evolved into a permanent expansion of English power that would have consequences extending far beyond Henry's own reign. The foundations had been laid for centuries of English involvement in Irish affairs, beginning a relationship that would prove to be one of the most significant and controversial aspects of English imperial expansion. By the early 1170s, Henry II had achieved a level of power and territorial control that was unprecedented in medieval Europe. His empire stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. His administrative innovations were transforming the practice of royal government, and his military forces had proven their effectiveness from Ireland to the Holy Land. Yet this very success contained within it the seeds of the greatest crisis of Henry's reign, as his efforts to provide appropriate inheritances for his numerous sons created tensions that would ultimately erupt into open rebellion, supported by his own wife and encouraged by his greatest international rival. The fundamental problem facing Henry was one that had no clear precedent in medieval political practice. Previous English kings had typically struggled with insufficient male heirs, while continental rulers who had been blessed with multiple sons had often seen their territories fragmented through partible inheritance that weakened central authority. Henry's solution was characteristically ambitious. He would divide his territories among his sons while retaining ultimate authority over their actions, creating a system of subordinate kingships that would preserve imperial unity while satisfying his children's legitimate expectations. This arrangement satisfied no one completely. Henry, the young king, who had been crowned as his father's heir in 1170, chafed under his father's continued control and resented his lack of real authority despite his royal title. Richard, who had been granted the Duchy of Aquitaine in 1172, found his independence circumscribed by his father's oversight and his resources limited by Henry's financial policies. Geoffrey, who had married Constance of Brittany and assumed control of that duchy in 1171, similarly struggled with the constraints his father imposed upon his authority. The situation was further complicated by the different political cultures that characterized Henry's various territories. In Normandy and England, traditions of strong central authority made paternal control over adult sons seem reasonable and appropriate. But in Aquitaine and Brittany, where noble independence was more highly valued and ducal authority had historically been more limited, Henry's continued oversight of his son's actions seemed tyrannical and contrary to local political customs. Eleanor of Aquitaine's role in these developing tensions was crucial and ultimately decisive. As Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, Eleanor possessed independent political authority that gave her legitimate interests in how her duchy was governed. Her particular favoritism toward Richard, who was clearly destined to inherit Aquitaine after her death, created additional complications in family relationships that Henry struggled to manage effectively. More significantly, Eleanor's personal relationship with Henry had deteriorated markedly during the 1160s as a result of the king's notorious infidelities and his increasingly autocratic behavior toward his family members. The passionate romance that had characterized their early marriage had given way to political calculation and mutual resentment, while Eleanor's independent spirit clashed with Henry's determination to maintain control over all aspects of his empire, including his own family relationships. The involvement of Louis VII of France in encouraging the rebellion of Henry's sons represented a masterful exploitation of Angevin family tensions for broader political purposes. Louis understood that the unity of the Angevin Empire depended ultimately upon Henry's personal authority over his sons, and that encouraging rebellion within the royal family offered the best prospect for weakening English power on the continent. His support for Henry's rebellious sons was cynical but effective, providing them with the external backing necessary to challenge their father's authority. The actual outbreak of rebellion in 1173 was triggered by Henry's decision to grant 3 strategically important castles to his youngest son John as part of the marriage arrangement with Alice of Maurienne. This grant appeared to Henry the young king and his brothers as evidence that their father was prepared to diminish their inheritances for the benefit of their younger brother, and it provided the immediate cause around which their long-standing grievances could crystallize into active resistance. The speed with which the rebellion spread throughout Henry's territories demonstrated both the extent of discontent with his rule and the effectiveness of the preparations that had been made by the rebels and their supporters. Within months of its outbreak, Henry found himself facing coordinated resistance in England, Normandy, Aquitaine, and Brittany, supported by a formidable international coalition that included France, Scotland, Flanders, and several other European powers. The military challenges that Henry faced during the Great Revolt were unprecedented in their scope and complexity. He was forced to defend multiple fronts simultaneously, while lacking the resources necessary to achieve decisive victory in any single theatre of operations. The rebel forces, supported by French gold and reinforced by Scottish and Flemish troops, possessed sufficient strength to maintain their resistance indefinitely, while Henry's own forces were stretched thin by the need to respond to threats throughout his empire. Henry's strategic response to this crisis demonstrated both his military genius and his political acumen. Rather than attempting to achieve total victory through massive military campaigns that might have devastated his territories, he adopted a more subtle approach that combined limited military operations with diplomatic initiatives designed to divide his enemies and encourage defections from the rebel cause. The capture of Eleanor of Aquitaine, while she was attempting to reach the safety of the French court, proved to be one of the most significant developments of the entire rebellion. Eleanor's involvement in the conspiracy against her husband had provided the rebels with crucial legitimacy and political coordination, while her personal knowledge of Henry's strengths and weaknesses had given them important strategic advantages. Her removal from the equation seriously weakened the rebel cause, while providing Henry with a valuable hostage whose fate would influence his son's future behavior. The military turning point of the rebellion came with the Battle of Alnwick in July 1174, where William the Lion of Scotland was captured along with many of his supporters. This victory eliminated Scottish pressure on Henry's northern borders, while demonstrating to wavering supporters that the royal cause was far from hopeless. The psychological impact of William's capture extended far beyond its immediate military significance, as it convinced many observers that divine providence favored Henry's cause over that of his rebellious family. Henry's personal response to the crisis was equally important in determining its ultimate outcome. His public penance at Thomas Becket's tomb in Canterbury, performed just days before the Battle of Alnwick, demonstrated his recognition that the rebellion might represent divine punishment for his role in the Archbishop's murder. This dramatic gesture of humility and repentance helped restore his moral authority, while encouraging his subjects to view the royal cause with renewed sympathy. The collapse of the rebellion during the summer and autumn of 1174 was as rapid and complete as its initial spread had been. One by one, Henry's enemies were forced to seek terms as their military situation became untenable and their financial resources were exhausted. The surrender of Henry the young king in September 1174 marked the effective end of organized resistance, though negotiations over the specific terms of settlement would continue for several months. The Treaty of Montlouis, which formally concluded the Great Revolt, demonstrated Henry's political wisdom and his understanding of the need to heal the wounds that the rebellion had created within his family. Rather than seeking revenge against his sons, Henry granted them increased revenues and territories that addressed some of their legitimate grievances while maintaining his ultimate authority over their actions. This policy of reconciliation helped restore family unity while demonstrating to his subjects that the king was capable of mercy as well as justice. the punishment meted out to Eleanor was notably harsher than that imposed upon her sons, reflecting both Henry's personal bitterness over her betrayal and his recognition that she had been the political architect of the rebellion. Her confinement in various English castles under close guard would continue for the remainder of Henry's reign, serving both as punishment for her treachery and as security against future conspiracies involving the royal family. The international consequences of the Great Revolt were equally significant for Henry's long-term political position. The defeat of the rebellion demonstrated the fundamental strength of the Angevin Empire while establishing Henry's reputation as one of Europe's most formidable rulers. Louis VII's failure to achieve decisive results despite the favorable circumstances created by the family rebellion weakened his position relative to Henry and discouraged future French adventures against Angevin territories. Perhaps most importantly, the successful suppression of the Great Revolt established important precedents for managing the complex relationships between imperial unity and local autonomy that would continue to challenge Henry's successors. The king's demonstration that even family rebellion could not break his empire provided a model for dealing with future challenges to imperial authority, while showing that political unity could be maintained despite cultural diversity and geographical dispersion. The Great Revolt of 1173-1174 thus represented both the greatest crisis of Henry's reign and one of his most significant victories. The king, who had faced coordinated rebellion by his wife, his sons, and a formidable international coalition, had not only survived, but had emerged with his authority enhanced and his empire strengthened. Yet the personal costs of this victory were enormous, as the trust and affection that had once characterized Henry's family relationships had been permanently damaged by the betrayals and conflicts of the rebellion years. The foundations for future family conflicts had been established during the Great Revolt, despite the apparent reconciliation that followed its conclusion. The fundamental problems that had caused the rebellion, the tensions between paternal authority and filial independence, the competing claims of different territories, and the personal animosities that had developed within the royal family, had not been resolved but merely papered over by the terms of the peace settlement. The apparent reconciliation that followed the conclusion of the Great Revolt in 1174 masked profound and lasting damage to the relationships within Henry II's family that would continue to fester and eventually erupt into new conflicts throughout the remaining years of his reign. While the immediate political crisis had been resolved through a combination of military victory and diplomatic compromise, the underlying causes of familial discord, competing ambitions, personal resentments, and fundamental disagreements about the proper distribution of power within the Angevin Empire remained largely unaddressed. Eleanor's imprisonment following the rebellion represented the most visible symbol of the breakdown of trust within the royal family. The woman who had once been Henry's closest advisor and most valued political partner was now confined under guard in a succession of English castles, effectively removed from any meaningful role in imperial governance. This harsh treatment reflected not only Henry's anger over her betrayal, but also his recognition that Eleanor's political sophistication and extensive network of supporters made her continued freedom too dangerous to permit. The conditions of Eleanor's confinement were designed to ensure her political isolation, while maintaining the dignity appropriate to her royal status. She was housed in comfortable apartments within secure castles, provided with a suitable household and adequate resources for her maintenance, and permitted to receive carefully screened visitors who posed no threat to royal security. But she was denied any meaningful participation in the governance of Aquitaine or any other territories, effectively ending a political career that had spanned more than 3 decades. Henry's treatment of his sons was outwardly more generous, but ultimately no more satisfactory to the parties involved. The young king received increased revenues and ceremonial recognition that enhanced his dignity without providing him with genuine political authority. Richard was confirmed in his position as Duke of Aquitaine, but remained subject to his father's oversight in all significant matters. Geoffrey's control over Brittany was similarly circumscribed by continuing paternal supervision that limited his ability to act independently. These arrangements satisfied none of the fundamental concerns that had motivated the rebellion in the first place. The young king continued to chafe under his father's authority while lacking any meaningful outlet for his political ambitions. Richard found his efforts to govern Aquitaine, according to local traditions, frustrated by his father's interference and his mother's absence. Geoffrey's position in Brittany remained dependent upon his father's continued support in ways that undermined his authority among the Breton nobility. The personal relationships between Henry and his sons had been permanently damaged by the events of 1173-1174, despite the public ceremonies of reconciliation that marked the formal end of the rebellion. The trust and affection that had once characterized family interactions had been replaced by mutual suspicion and calculation that poisoned even routine discussions about territorial administration and family responsibilities. Each party remained alert for signs of treachery from the others, creating an atmosphere of tension that made genuine cooperation increasingly difficult to achieve. The problem was compounded by the different expectations that prevailed in various parts of Henry's empire regarding the proper relationships between fathers and adult sons. In England and Normandy, where traditions of strong royal authority had been well established, Henry's continued control over his son's actions seemed reasonable and appropriate. But in Aquitaine and Brittany, where ducal power had traditionally been more limited and noble independence more highly valued, such paternal control appeared tyrannical and contrary to local political culture. Louis VII's continued efforts to exploit these family tensions represented an ongoing threat to Angevin unity that Henry struggled to counter effectively. The French king had learned valuable lessons from the failure of the Great Revolt about the importance of timing and the need for sustained support for any future rebellions. His court became a refuge for discontented Angevin nobles and a center of intrigue directed against Henry's rule, while his diplomatic initiatives sought to create new opportunities for weakening the Angevin Empire. The death of Henry the Young King in June 1183 fundamentally altered the dynamics of family politics while creating new opportunities for conflict among the surviving sons. The young king's death from dysentery during a renewed rebellion in southern France removed the most obvious focal point for anti-Henrician sentiment, while raising new questions about the succession that would need to be resolved. His final illness was marked by expressions of repentance for his rebellion against his father, providing some measure of personal reconciliation between father and son before death made further conflict impossible. The immediate consequence of the young king's death was to make Richard the heir apparent to the English throne and the senior figure among Henry's surviving sons. But this elevation in status came with new responsibilities and restrictions that Richard found no more palatable than his previous position as Duke of Aquitaine. Henry's expectation that Richard would surrender Aquitaine to his younger brother John in preparation for inheriting the broader Angevin inheritance was met with fierce resistance from a son who had no intention of abandoning the duchy that he loved above all other territories. This conflict over the redistribution of territories following the young king's death revealed the fundamental impossibility of Henry's approach to family politics. Each son had developed strong emotional and political attachments to particular territories that made them unwilling to accept changes in their positions regardless of the broader logic of imperial administration. Richard's refusal to surrender Aquitaine to John created deadlock that could only be resolved through renewed conflict or fundamental changes in Henry's policies. Geoffrey's position during these negotiations was particularly complex, as he sought to advance his own interests while avoiding entanglement in the conflicts between Richard and John. His marriage to Constance of Brittany had given him a measure of independence from his father's authority that his brothers lacked, while his political skills enabled him to play different parties against each other in ways that enhanced his own position. But his efforts to maintain neutrality in family conflicts became increasingly difficult as tensions escalated. The renewed warfare that broke out in 1183 between Richard and his younger brothers was both cause and consequence of the continuing breakdown of family relationships. Henry's inability to impose a peaceful resolution of the succession question had allowed conflicts to escalate to the point where only military action seemed capable of producing definitive results. The death of the young king during this fighting brought temporary peace, but failed to address the underlying issues that had caused the conflict. Geoffrey's death in a tournament accident in August 1186 further simplified the succession question, while creating new complications for Henry's long-term planning. The reduction of the royal family to just two adult sons, Richard and John, eliminated some potential sources of conflict while intensifying the rivalry between the remaining siblings. Geoffrey's death also removed one of the most politically astute members of the royal family, a loss that would have significant consequences for the empire's future stability. The emotional impact of losing two sons in rapid succession took a heavy toll on Henry, who had already been showing signs of the physical and mental strain imposed by decades of intensive political and military activity. The king, who had once seemed tireless in his energy and inexhaustible in his political resources, was beginning to show his age, while the constant stress of family conflicts was undermining his health and judgment. These personal weaknesses would become increasingly apparent during the final years of his reign. Eleanor's continued imprisonment became both more painful and more problematic as the family situation deteriorated. Her political experience and diplomatic skills might have been valuable in resolving some of the conflicts that divided her sons, but Henry's refusal to release her prevented any possibility of constructive family negotiations. This decision reflected both his personal bitterness and his fear that Eleanor's release might provide new opportunities for rebellion against his authority. The international implications of the continuing Angevin family conflicts were not lost on Henry's enemies, particularly Philip Augustus of France, who had succeeded his father Louis VII in 1180. The new French king possessed both greater resources and more aggressive intentions than his predecessor, while the obvious divisions within the Angevin family provided him with numerous opportunities for intervention. Philip's patient cultivation of relationships with Richard and John created the foundation for future French success against the Angevin Empire. By the late 1180s, it had become clear that Henry's approach to managing family relationships and imperial succession had failed to achieve its essential objectives. Despite his military successes and administrative innovations, the king had been unable to create stable arrangements for the transfer of power to the next generation. The conflicts that had begun with the Great Revolt had never been fully resolved, and new tensions were continuously emerging that threatened to tear apart the empire that Henry had spent his life building. The stage was being set for the final crisis of Henry's reign, as the accumulated grievances and unresolved conflicts within his family combined with external pressures to create a situation that would test the very foundations of Angevin power. The king, who'd survived so many challenges throughout his long reign, was about to face the greatest test of his political career, and the outcome would determine not only his personal fate, but the future of the empire he had created. As the 1180s drew to a close, the accumulated weight of family conflicts, international pressures, and physical decline was taking an increasingly heavy toll on Henry II. The once vigorous king whose energy and political acumen had created the most powerful empire in Western Europe. The approach of his 56th birthday found Henry facing challenges that were both more complex and more dangerous than any he had previously encountered. While his own capacity to meet these challenges was being undermined by declining health and the emotional exhaustion that resulted from decades of family strife, the accession of Philip Augustus to the French throne in 1180 had fundamentally altered the strategic balance that Henry had managed so skillfully during his conflicts with Louis VII, where Louis had been cautious, defensive, and often indecisive. Philip was aggressive, calculating, and possessed of both the resources and the political will necessary to challenge Angevin power directly. More importantly, Philip understood that the divisions within Henry's family represented his best opportunity for achieving the French monarchy's long-standing goal of reducing English power on the continent. Philip's cultivation of Richard during the 1180s was a masterpiece of diplomatic manipulation that exploited both Richard's frustrations with his father's continued control and his fears about John's growing influence over royal policy. The French king's patient approach to this relationship enabled him to present himself as Richard's protector and ally, while positioning France as the natural refuge for Angevin princes who felt oppressed by paternal authority. This strategy proved devastatingly effective in undermining the unity that had been essential to Henry's success. The specific issues that brought the final crisis to a head were typical of the complex territorial and dynastic disputes that characterized medieval European politics. Philip's demands for recognition of his authority over certain contested territories in Normandy and Aquitaine were technically justified under feudal law, but were clearly designed to weaken Henry's position and create opportunities for future French expansion. Henry's attempts to negotiate these disputes while maintaining his essential interests proved increasingly difficult as Philip escalated his demands and timetabled his expectations. Richard's gradual alignment with Philip Augustus during 1188 and 1189 represented the culmination of years of careful French cultivation and growing Angevin family discord. Richard's decision to openly ally himself with his father's greatest enemy was motivated by a complex mixture of personal grievances, political calculations, and genuine fears about his future prospects within the Angevin system. His actions would prove decisive in bringing about the final crisis of his father's reign. The military campaigns that erupted across Henry's French territories during 1188 and 1189 were characterized by a level of coordination and strategic purpose that had been lacking in previous conflicts. Philip's forces operated according to a coherent plan designed to maximize pressure on Henry while minimizing the risks to French interests. While Richard's intimate knowledge of Angevin military capabilities and territorial weaknesses enabled the Allies to achieve rapid successes that had seemed impossible in earlier conflicts, Henry's response to these challenges revealed both his continued strategic acumen and the limitations imposed by his declining health and reduced resources. The king, who had once been capable of conducting multiple military campaigns simultaneously while managing complex diplomatic negotiations, now found himself struggling to coordinate even basic defensive operations. His famous energy and endurance were clearly beginning to fail him at the moment when they were most desperately needed. The siege of Le Mans in June 1189 provided a particularly poignant symbol of Henry's declining fortunes. As the city where he had been born and where he had spent much of his youth fell to the combined forces of Philip and Richard, after only token resistance, Henry's retreat from his birthplace was reportedly conducted with such haste that he was unable to organize effective destruction of the bridges and fortifications that might have slowed his enemy's advance. The loss of Le Mans was both a military defeat and a psychological blow that seemed to drain the king of his remaining will to resist. The physical symptoms of Henry's declining health became increasingly apparent during the final months of his reign, as contemporaries noted his obvious weakness, his difficulty in maintaining the demanding schedule that royal governance required, and his growing dependence upon advisors whose loyalty and competence could not match those of the men who had served him during his prime. The bleeding ulcer that would ultimately prove fatal was already causing him significant pain and limiting his ability to function effectively as a military commander and political leader. Perhaps most significantly, Henry's legendary political instincts seemed to be failing him during this final crisis. The king, who had once been renowned for his ability to divide his enemies and exploit their weaknesses, now found himself increasingly isolated, while his attempts to negotiate favorable terms for ending the conflict were undermined by his enemies' recognition of his weakness and their confidence in ultimate victory. The conference at Balen on July 4, 1189, marked the nadir of Henry's political career, as the king, who had once dictated terms to emperors and popes, was forced to accept a humiliating surrender that acknowledged Richard as his heir, while granting significant concessions to Philip Augustus. Henry's physical appearance at this meeting reportedly shocked even his enemies, as the once formidable king appeared as a broken old man, whose authority had been permanently shattered by the rebellion of his own son and the relentless pressure of French diplomacy. The specific terms imposed upon Henry at Balen were designed not merely to end the immediate military crisis, but to establish precedents that would permanently weaken Angevin power and enhance French influence over English continental territories. Henry's agreement to recognize Philip's territorial claims, to arrange Richard's marriage to Philip's sister Alice, and to pay substantial compensation represented a comprehensive defeat that reversed many of the gains that had been achieved during earlier phases of his reign. But perhaps the most devastating blow to Henry's remaining morale came with the discovery that even his beloved youngest son John had joined the rebellion against him. This ultimate betrayal by the child he had favored above all others seemed to break whatever spirit remained in the failing king, convincing him that his life's work had been meaningless and that his death would be welcomed rather than mourned by those who should have been most grateful for his achievements. Henry's final journey to Chinon Castle, undertaken in a litter because he was too weak to remain in the saddle, was marked by the kind of physical and emotional suffering that seemed to encapsulate the tragedy of his final years. The king, who had once controlled territories stretching from Scotland to Spain, now possessed effective authority over little more than the castle where he lay dying, while his former subjects and allies positioned themselves to benefit from the new political arrangements that his defeat had made inevitable. The 2 days that elapsed between Henry's final surrender at Balen and his death at Chinon on July 6, 1189, were marked by the kind of quiet despair that contrasted sharply with the energy and ambition that had characterized his entire adult life. Contemporary accounts suggest that Henry spent these final hours reflecting on the failures and betrayals that had marked his reign's conclusion, while expressing regret for the mistakes that had alienated his family and destroyed his empire's unity. Henry's last recorded words, reportedly whispered to a faithful servant who remained with him when everyone else had departed, were said to be, "Shame, shame on a vanquished king." These words, whether authentic or legendary, captured the essence of a tragedy that had transformed one of medieval Europe's most successful rulers into a broken man, whose death would be greeted with relief rather than mourning by those who had once acclaimed his achievements. The immediate aftermath of Henry's death revealed the extent to which his personal authority had been the primary force holding together the complex political and territorial arrangements that constituted the Angevin Empire. Within hours of the king's death, his servants began stripping valuable items from his body, while political leaders throughout his former territories moved quickly to position themselves advantageously for the new political arrangements that Richard's succession would inevitably bring. Henry II's death on July 6, 1189, marked not merely the end of a remarkable individual life, but the conclusion of an era in medieval European history. The king, whose innovations in law, administration, and territorial organization had influenced political development throughout Europe, had ultimately been unable to solve the fundamental problem of creating stable arrangements for imperial succession that could survive the ambitions and conflicts of the next generation. In the stifling heat of that July day in 1189, King Henry II of England lay dying in the chambers of Chinon Castle, abandoned by all but a handful of loyal retainers who had remained faithful to their master even as his empire crumbled around him. The man who had once commanded the obedience of subjects from the Scottish borders to the Mediterranean Sea was reduced to the company of servants and minor officials, while the great nobles and administrators who had built their careers upon his favour hastily transferred their allegiances to his victorious son Richard. The castle that sheltered Henry's final hours was rich with memories of happier times, when he had held court here as the undisputed master of his vast territories and had received the homage of princes, prelates, and ambassadors from across Europe. The very walls seemed to echo with the voices of councillors and petitioners who had once competed for his attention, while the empty chambers bore silent witness to the magnificence that had characterized Angevin court life during the height of Henry's power. But now those same chambers witnessed only the quiet agony of a broken king, whose physical pain was compounded by the emotional torment of complete political defeat and family betrayal. The bleeding ulcer that had troubled Henry for months was now beyond the capacity of medieval medicine to treat, while the fever that consumed him seemed to burn away the last remnants of the will to live that had sustained him through so many previous crises. The small group of attendants who maintained their vigil beside the dying king included William Marshal, the greatest knight of the age, whose loyalty to the Angevin cause had never wavered despite the catastrophic reversals of recent months. Marshal's presence provided some comfort to Henry during his final hours, as it represented continuity with the chivalric ideals and personal bonds that had once made service to the Angevin crown a source of pride and honour throughout Western Europe. Geoffrey, Henry's illegitimate son, who served as Archbishop of York, was another of the few family members who remained with his father until the end. Geoffrey's steadfast loyalty contrasted sharply with the behaviour of Henry's legitimate children, whose rebellion had brought about the very crisis that was now claiming their father's life. His presence at the deathbed would later be remembered as one of the few bright moments in the tragic conclusion of Henry's reign. The physical process of Henry's dying was protracted and painful, as medieval chroniclers recorded with the clinical attention to detail that characterized their treatment of significant political events. The king's fever alternated with periods of clarity, during which he seemed to grasp the full magnitude of his defeats and the implications of his approaching death for the future of the territories he had spent his life building. These moments of lucidity were perhaps more torturous than the delirium, as they forced Henry to confront the complete collapse of everything he had worked to achieve. The news that John, his youngest and most beloved son, had also joined Richard's rebellion reached Henry during his final day of life, delivered by a messenger who seemed unaware of the devastating impact this intelligence would have upon the dying king. Henry's reaction to this ultimate betrayal was one of complete despair, as he finally understood that even the child he had favoured above all others preferred alliance with his enemies to loyalty to his father. "Now, let all things go as they will," Henry reportedly whispered upon hearing this news. "I care no more for myself or for the world." The approaching end became apparent to all who attended the king during the evening of July 6th. as his breathing grew labored and his periods of consciousness became increasingly brief. The handful of loyal servants who had remained with him through his final ordeal prepared for the ritual obligations that would attend the death of a king, while messengers were dispatched to inform Richard and other important figures of the imminent conclusion of Henry's reign. In his final moments, Henry summoned enough strength to make a sacramental confession to the priest who had been summoned to attend his deathbed. This last act of Christian devotion provided some measure of spiritual comfort to the dying king, while fulfilling the religious requirements that medieval culture imposed upon departing monarchs. The content of this confession remained secret, as was proper, but its completion allowed Henry to face death with whatever peace such rituals could provide. Henry II died as the sun was setting on July 6, 1189, at the age of 56, having ruled England for 34 years, 8 months, and 11 days. His death was not marked by the elaborate ceremonies that typically attended royal departures, as the political circumstances of his final defeat had scattered his court and left him with only the most basic attendance necessary for maintaining royal dignity during his final hours. The immediate aftermath of Henry's death revealed the complete breakdown of the loyalty and respect that had once bound together the complex network of relationships supporting Angevin rule. Within hours of the king's final breath, his servants began stripping valuable items from his chambers and even from his body, seizing whatever portable wealth they could carry before departing to seek new masters who might reward their future service. The discovery of Henry's corpse by William Marshal and Geoffrey of York, when they returned to check on their fallen master, was one of the most poignant moments in medieval chronicles. The great king lay naked and abandoned, stripped even of his royal robes by servants who had shown him no loyalty in death, despite the favor he had shown them in life. This degrading treatment of Henry's remains symbolized the complete collapse of the authority and respect that had once made him the most feared and admired ruler in Europe. The urgent need to prepare Henry's body for burial, while preserving whatever dignity remained to the Angevin name, led Marshal and Geoffrey to improvise royal regalia from whatever materials they could locate within the castle. A crown was taken from a religious statue, along with a scepter and ring that would allow Henry to be buried with at least the appearance of the royal dignity that had been stripped from him in his final hours. The transportation of Henry's body to Fontevraud Abbey for burial was undertaken with as much ceremony as circumstances permitted, though the haste required by the July heat and the political instability following the king's death prevented the elaborate funeral processions that typically marked royal deaths. The route taken by the funeral cortege passed through territories that had recently been devastated by the warfare that had brought about Henry's defeat, providing a sobering reminder of the costs of the family conflicts that had destroyed his empire. Richard's arrival at Fontevraud to view his father's body was observed with fascination by contemporary chroniclers, who noted the new king's apparent lack of emotion as he gazed upon the remains of the man he had helped to destroy. Some observers reported that blood flowed from Henry's nostrils when Richard approached the bier, which they interpreted as a supernatural sign of the dead king's anger at his son's presence. Whether this phenomenon actually occurred or was merely legend, it captured the sense of unnatural tragedy that surrounded Henry's death and his relationship with his children. The burial of Henry II at Fontevraud Abbey was conducted with appropriate religious ceremony, but without the elaborate state funeral that might have been expected for a king of his stature and achievements. The political circumstances surrounding his death, combined with Richard's eagerness to begin his own reign, necessitated relatively modest obsequies that reflected the reduced circumstances of Henry's final months, rather than the magnificence that had characterized most of his reign. Eleanor of Aquitaine's release from imprisonment following her husband's death marked the end of one of the most remarkable political careers in medieval history. The woman who had been Queen of France and England, who had participated in crusades and rebellions, and who had shaped the political development of two kingdoms, was finally free to resume an active role in the governance of territories that she had helped to create. Her survival of Henry by 15 years would allow her to play crucial roles in the reigns of both Richard and John. The immediate political consequences of Henry's death were felt throughout the Angevin territories as nobles, administrators, and ordinary subjects adjusted to the reality of Richard's succession. The new king's reputation as a military commander was well established, but his lack of experience in civilian administration and his known preference for crusading over domestic governance created uncertainties about the future direction of royal policy. The international reaction to Henry's death reflected the complex mixture of relief and concern that his passing inspired among his contemporaries. Enemies who had feared his power could now hope for opportunities to recover territories and influence that had been lost to Angevin expansion, while allies worried about the stability of arrangements that had depended upon Henry's personal authority and political skill. The assessment of Henry's reign that began immediately after his death would continue for centuries, as chroniclers, historians, and political theorists attempted to understand the significance of his achievements and failures. The king who had created the most powerful empire in Western Europe through innovative administration and military success had also been responsible for some of the most notorious scandals of his age, including the murder of Thomas Becket and the destruction of his own family through political ambition. Perhaps the most fitting epitaph for Henry II was provided by Gerald of Wales, who wrote that the king had been great in all things, but in nothing more so than in the magnitude of his troubles. This assessment captured both Henry's remarkable achievements and the tragic circumstances of his decline, recognizing him as a figure whose successes had been matched by failures of equal significance. Henry's death at Chinon marked the end of an era in medieval European history, as the political innovations and territorial arrangements that he had created would not long survive the challenges that faced his successors. The empire that had seemed so formidable under his personal direction would prove to be fatally dependent upon the extraordinary abilities of its creator, and its gradual dissolution under Richard and John would demonstrate the impossibility of maintaining such complex political structures without the genius that had originally brought them into being. Yet even as Henry lay dying in his abandoned chamber at Chinon, the legal and administrative innovations that represented his greatest legacy were already beginning the process of evolution and adaptation that would ensure their survival long after the empire that had created them had passed into history. The foundations of English common law, the principles of royal administration, and the concepts of governmental accountability that Henry had established would prove more durable than the territorial conquests and family arrangements that had consumed so much of his energy during his final years. In the immediate aftermath of Henry II's death, as his body lay in the quiet dignity of Fontevraud Abbey, and his son Richard prepared to assume the burdens of kingship, contemporaries struggled to assess the true significance of a reign that had encompassed both magnificent achievements and tragic failures. The king who had revolutionized English law, created an empire spanning two kingdoms, and established administrative systems that would endure for centuries, had also been responsible for the murder of England's most beloved saint, and had died abandoned by the very family members whose futures he had sought to secure. The legal innovations that represented Henry's most enduring contribution to civilization were already beginning to demonstrate their remarkable durability and adaptability. The common law system that he had established was proving capable of evolution and refinement that would eventually make it one of the most successful legal frameworks in human history. The principles of jury trial, standardized procedures, and equal justice that he had introduced were spreading beyond England's borders and would eventually influence legal development throughout the world. Henry's administrative achievements were equally impressive in their scope and lasting impact. The governmental machinery that he had created to manage his vast empire had established new standards for efficiency, accountability, and professional competence that would serve as models for other European kingdoms. The civil service traditions that emerged from his reforms would continue to evolve and improve, creating institutional continuity that would prove more valuable than the territorial acquisitions that had initially seemed so important. The economic foundations of prosperity that Henry had laid through his legal and administrative reforms were already beginning to generate the wealth and commercial activity that would characterize later medieval England. The security of property rights, the reliability of legal procedures, and the efficiency of governmental services that his innovations had provided created conditions that encouraged trade, investment, and economic development on an unprecedented scale. But the assessment of Henry's legacy could not ignore the darker aspects of his reign, particularly the conflicts with the Church that had culminated in Thomas Becket's murder and the family betrayals that had marked his final years. These failures had not merely damaged Henry's personal reputation, they had created precedents and patterns that would continue to trouble his successors and influence political development throughout medieval Europe. The Becket affair, in particular, had established dangerous precedents about the relationship between royal authority and ecclesiastical independence that would complicate church-state relations for generations. While Henry's basic position about the need for unified legal authority had been sound, his methods of achieving this goal had been disastrously counterproductive. The martyrdom of Thomas Becket had created a permanent reminder of the dangers of royal tyranny that would inspire resistance to excessive governmental authority throughout English history. The family conflicts that had dominated the later years of Henry's reign revealed fundamental problems with medieval approaches to imperial succession that would continue to plague his descendants. The combination of multiple male heirs with extensive territorial holdings created almost insurmountable challenges for maintaining political unity, while the personal relationships between family members proved too fragile to withstand the pressures of political ambition and competing loyalties. The rapid dissolution of the Angevin Empire under Richard and John demonstrated the extent to which Henry's achievements had depended upon his personal abilities rather than institutional foundations. The territories that he had acquired through inheritance, marriage, and conquest proved impossible for his successors to maintain without the extraordinary diplomatic skill and administrative genius that Henry had brought to their governance. Richard's reign, dominated by his participation in the Third Crusade and his conflicts with Philip Augustus of France, revealed both the strengths and limitations of the military traditions that Henry had established. While Richard proved to be an even more capable military commander than his father, his neglect of civilian administration and his absence from England for long periods weakened the governmental systems that Henry had worked so hard to create. John's reign would prove even more disastrous for the Angevin inheritance, as his political misjudgments and military failures led to the loss of most of the French territories that Henry had accumulated. The signing of Magna Carta in 1215 represented both a culmination of the constitutional principles that Henry had inadvertently encouraged through his legal reforms and a repudiation of the autocratic tendencies that had characterized his personal approach to kingship. Yet even as the territorial empire that Henry had built was collapsing, the institutional innovations that represented his greatest achievements were demonstrating their capacity for survival and continued development. The English governmental system that emerged from the crisis of John's reign was stronger and more accountable than what had existed before, having been tested by adversity and refined through practical experience. The international influence of Henry's innovations extended far beyond the boundaries of his own territories. As other European rulers sought to emulate the administrative and legal systems that had proved so effective in England, the concepts of professional civil service, standardized legal procedures, and systematic record-keeping that Henry had pioneered gradually spread throughout medieval Europe, contributing to the development of more effective and accountable forms of governance. Perhaps most importantly, Henry's reign had established the principle that governmental authority should be exercised through established legal procedures rather than arbitrary personal discretion. This concept of government under law would eventually develop into constitutional limitations on royal authority that would fundamentally transform the nature of European kingship and contribute to the emergence of modern democratic institutions. The cultural legacy of Henry's reign was equally significant, as the court that he and Eleanor had maintained had set new standards for intellectual sophistication and artistic patronage that influenced cultural development throughout Europe. The troubadour poetry that flourished under Eleanor's protection, the architectural innovations that characterized Angevin building projects, and the scholarly activities that they supported, contributed to the cultural flowering that would characterize the later medieval period. The tragic aspects of Henry's personal story should not obscure the magnitude of his positive achievements or their lasting significance for human civilization. The king who died abandoned and betrayed at Chinon had nevertheless created institutions and established principles that would continue to serve humanity long after his personal failures had been forgotten. His reign represented both the possibilities and limitations of individual leadership in shaping historical development. The complexity of Henry's legacy reflects the complexity of the man himself. Brilliant but flawed, innovative but sometimes destructive, capable of great achievements but also responsible for terrible failures. His story serves as a reminder that even the most successful leaders must grapple with limitations imposed by their circumstances, their character, and their relationships with others. Modern assessments of Henry II have generally emphasized his positive contributions while acknowledging the tragic aspects of his personal story. Historians recognize him as one of medieval Europe's most important rulers, whose innovations in law and administration had consequences extending far beyond his own lifetime. The foundations that he laid for English governmental development would prove more durable and significant than the territorial empire that captured contemporary attention. As we drift towards sleep, contemplating the complex legacy of this remarkable king, we might reflect on the enduring nature of institutional innovations compared to the transitory character of political arrangements based on personal authority. Henry's legal reforms continue to influence our daily lives more than 8 centuries after his death, while the territorial disputes that seem so important to his contemporaries have long since been resolved by forces that he could never have anticipated. The king, who sought to build an empire that would last forever, instead created institutions that have proved far more durable than any territorial conquest. His true monument is not found in the castles and cathedrals that bear his name, impressive though they may be, but in the legal principles and governmental practices that continue to serve societies throughout the world. In this sense, Henry II achieved a form of immortality that few rulers in human history have equaled, despite the personal tragedies that marked the conclusion of his extraordinary life. As our long journey through the remarkable life of Henry II draws to its gentle close, we find ourselves in the quiet abbey of Fontevraud, where the great king's earthly remains have rested in peace for more than 8 centuries. The stone effigy that marks his tomb shows him not as the broken man who died at Chinon, but as he would wish to be remembered, crowned and dignified, holding the symbols of authority that he wielded so effectively during the prime of his reign. Beside him lies Eleanor of Aquitaine, the extraordinary woman who shared his triumphs and his sorrows, who bore his children and later rebelled against his authority, but who ultimately came to rest beside him in death, as she had stood beside him in their youth, their stone faces, worn smooth by centuries of pilgrims' touches, gaze upward toward heaven with expressions of serene acceptance that seems to transcend the bitter conflicts that marked their final years together. The abbey itself breathes tranquility, its ancient stones warmed by gentle sunlight filtering through windows that have witnessed the passing of countless seasons since Henry's time. The peaceful gardens surrounding the royal tombs bloom with flowers whose ancestors may have known the fragrance of medieval springs, while the soft sound of monastic prayers continues a tradition of devotion that has endured since long before Henry's birth. In this sacred place, the tumult and ambition that characterized Henry's life seem distant and dreamlike, replaced by the eternal quietude that comes to all human endeavor, however grand or terrible it may have seemed to those who lived it. The king who once controlled territories from Scotland to Spain, who reformed laws that still govern our daily lives, and who faced the ultimate betrayal of those he loved most, has found the peace that eluded him during his final troubled years. The legal system that Henry created continues to evolve and serve justice in courts throughout the English-speaking world, though few who benefit from its protections remember the name of its medieval architect. The governmental principles he established have grown into democratic institutions that he could never have imagined, while the administrative practices he pioneered have been refined and adapted to serve societies far more complex than any he knew. Perhaps this is the truest measure of a life well lived, that its positive contributions continue to benefit humanity long after its failures have been forgiven and its sorrows have been eased by the healing passage of time. Henry's innovations in law and governance represent gifts to future generations that far outweigh the personal tragedies that marked his final years, ensuring that his legacy remains vibrant and beneficial centuries after his death. As you allow sleep to carry you gently away from these medieval scenes, let your thoughts dwell not on the conflicts and betrayals that marked Henry's final years, but on the enduring institutions he created and the principles of justice he established. In courtrooms around the world, his vision of equal treatment under law continues to protect the innocent and restrain the powerful, while his administrative innovations continue to serve the cause of effective and accountable government. The Angevin Empire that seemed so important to Henry and his contemporaries has long since passed into history, its territories redistributed among different nations and its political arrangements superseded by forms of government that Henry could never have conceived. But the legal and administrative foundations that he laid have proved more durable than any castle walls, more lasting than any territorial conquest, and more valuable than any treasure that medieval kings could accumulate. Rest peacefully then, knowing that even the most troubled lives can leave behind legacies of enduring value, and that the pursuit of justice and good governance represents a form of immortality available to all who seek to serve something greater than their own immediate interests. Henry II's true monument is not carved in stone, but written in the laws and institutions that continue to serve humanity, ensuring that his greatest achievements will endure as long as civilization values justice, order, and the rule of law. In the gentle quiet of Fontevraud Abbey, where Henry and Eleanor sleep their eternal sleep surrounded by the prayers of generations, all earthly ambitions have been laid to rest in favor of the lasting peace that comes to those whose labors, however imperfect, have contributed to the betterment of human society. May their rest be peaceful, and may your own sleep be filled with the serenity that comes from contemplating lives lived on a grand scale, with all their achievements and failures, their triumphs and their sorrows, finally resolved in the perfect stillness of eternity. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and may the gentle whispers of history carry you into restful slumber, knowing that even kings and queens must ultimately find their peace in the same quiet rest that awaits us all. The story ends where all stories must, in silence, in peace, and in the hope that what we have built will outlast what we have lost, and that the love we have shared will endure long after the conflicts we have endured are forgotten. Good night.